Chapter 258. Facing the last enemy. Soren still didn't hesitate at all. His two swords turned into a cold light that shrouded the enemy's vital points. Because he didn't need to keep the enemy alive, and he didn't need to torture anything from the indigenous people in front of him. Since Soren had already planned to explore the enemy's details, there was no need to torture information from the captive. More importantly, the two sides didn't speak the same language at all. Plop. Blood splattered out of the wound. Soren stabbed into the abdomen of the skinny aborigine in front of him, then suddenly cut open the abdomen with the tip of the sword, and finally cut off a head with his right hand. Since mastering the sword form, beheading, Soren had become more and more fond of beheading the enemy. As long as the enemy's head was cut off, they would die directly. But if the other parts of the body were cut off, they could still hold on for a while. Of course, this may also be related to the hidden violence in his heart. As a rogue, he actually had the blood of a berserker deep in his heart. A row of data emerged. Soren glanced at it and found that the enemy gave a lot of slaughter EXP. The bottom level of the indigenous people was similar to ordinary people, but the warrior class of the indigenous people was very strong. Their task was to hunt and fight, which was basically a way to gain experience and strength. The ordinary work was basically all on the bottom level of the indigenous people. The 5 enemies were all professions above grade 3. Because there were no spellcasters among them, the slaughter EXP they gave was similar to wilderness monsters of the same grade. A total of 21,500 slaughter EXP was given to Soren. It seemed that they were indeed elites. After killing 20 or so of these enemies, Soren could easily level up his profession by 1 level. Sure enough, sneak attacks are more suitable for me. There were 2 keys to Soren's easy victory. One was that the sneak attack of backstab caught the enemy off guard. In this situation, it was easy to expand the victory in an instant. The other was that he had the support of stone skin, so he didn't have to be afraid of the enemy's blow dart. Because even if Soren had more than 20 points of constitution, he didn't have much confidence to resist the poison on the blow dart. One thing that must be admitted was that these indigenous people had good skills in toxicology. Some were even better than the alchemists on the mainland. There were very few spellcasters among the aborigines. However, he could not rule out the existence of special beings with psionic powers. There were basically no wizards here, only sorcerers and shamans. Shaman priests were a different kind of priest, and their spells were quite different. Since there were no real gods in the outer islands, the spells of the shaman priests were more inclined towards elemental attacks, which were similar to evocation magic attacks. In areas where totem beliefs were distributed, this kind of shaman priest was more common. There were also ancient shaman doctrines that simply worshipped the souls of their ancestors. Surveys had shown that the more civilized a place was and the more widespread the written education, the higher the possibility of spellcasters appearing there. Soren started to collect the loot. The aborigines didn't have anything valuable on them, and Soren wasn't looking for gold, silver, or jewelry. He rummaged through the bodies of the aborigines and soon found 6 blowers and a small bottle of unknown potion. There were steel needles soaked in it. Soren tried to identify the item, and when he saw the attributes, he was so shocked that he broke out in cold sweat. Item type: blow dart, +3, item grade: rare, grade 3. Item description: this is a very special blow dart that originated from the Aborigine scouts in the outer islands. In the thousands of years of history of the Aborigines, although it didn't bring them civilization and wisdom, it allowed them to develop some other special skills. This blow dart is smeared with a refined and purified neurotoxin. It will start to take effect in the blink of an eye after hitting the enemy. The dosage of a blow dart can anesthetize an elephant for a short time. There are very few humans who can successfully resist it. Requirements: none. Effect: causes 5 to 10 poison damage to the target, and then after hitting the target, a test of anesthetizing toxin with a difficulty of 20 points will be initiated. Any target that can't pass the test will faint in a short time. Damn, it's actually a grade 3 rare item? Soren immediately broke out in cold sweat when he saw the item's data because he found that the probability of him passing the test was less than 50%. Fortunately, he activated the stone skin spell in advance, or else he might have failed miserably. Soren took a quick look and put away the blow darts, needles, and potions. Then he leaned over and looked at the captured pirate scout. The pirate was already breathing out more than he was breathing in. The tendons in his hands and feet were all cut off. It was basically impossible to save him. Unless there was a high-grade priest to cast a restoration spell on him, he would be paralyzed even if he was barely saved. The key was that there were no priests in the camp. "I've avenged you," Soren walked over with a blank expression, held his hand and said in a deep voice, "Let me relieve your pain." A cold light appeared. After relieving the pain of the dying pirate, he slowly closed his eyes. There was no other way in this situation. Many times after a battle, there were wounded people who needed others to relieve their pain. After all, the number of priests was only a small number, and it was difficult to popularize expensive divine spells. Otherwise, the disputes in various places would not be at this level. Soren slowly stood up and glanced coldly at the indigenous slave who was killed by him. If this guy didn't escape, the indigenous people probably wouldn't have found them so quickly. Bang! Soren stepped on the indigenous slave's head and then walked out of the cave. Killing these scouts was only the first step. Since Soren had the intention to kill the indigenous people, he naturally had no mercy in his heart. Under the pitch-black night sky, Soren's figure moved forward at high speed in the jungle. The night was his best disguise. At the same time, with the blessing of dark vision, Soren was even more drowsed than drows. Some night-hunting beasts began to appear, and Soren carefully avoided them. There were some strange fluorescent plants around. If a flying insect approached, it would be swallowed immediately. There were many types of carnivorous plants in the outer islands, so even animals would not easily get close to some places. The sound of a river came from the front. Soren moved forward quickly. This island was not very big, about 50 kilometers in length. It was narrow at both ends and wide in the middle. There was a large primitive jungle inside, and then there was a river flowing from another island. The width of the river was about 50 meters. There was nothing strange on the surface, but it was different after people went down. Soren was not in the mood to care about these piranhas, even if they could provide about 2 slaughter EXP. The signs of human activity in front began to become obvious. Soren even saw abandoned broken fishing nets by the river. The indigenous people's source of food was not all hunting. They also knew how to farm, but the area of land that could be farmed was not much. Soren's figure gradually merged into the darkness. He moved along a muddy road that was obviously often used by people, and soon he saw the cultivated land. There were no crops in the land now, but there were crops like corn and sorghum stacked next to the field. There was the light of torches in the distance, and there was a faint sound of people. Soren first made sure that there were no hidden sentries nearby, and then gradually approached. He was not sure if the indigenous people here had any special means, so he did not get too close. In front of him was a simple village. Looking at the number of houses, the population was about 1,500 people. The indigenous people's population was more densely distributed because they could not survive in the outer islands with a small number of individuals. The periphery was the indigenous people at the bottom. They all lived in low shacks and the surroundings were very messy. In the center there was a tall building, and in the distance there were torches and guards. The indigenous people had a tribal system, similar to the tribal system in Africa where one could marry more than 100 wives to work. The internal hierarchy was strict and the gap was quite large. Sauron glanced at it for a moment, and then quietly sneaked in. Chapter 259. As soon as he entered the tribe, Soren immediately smelled a strange smell. He couldn't tell what the smell was, but it was indeed a little stinky. The environment of the entire tribe was very dirty and messy. There were feces left by children everywhere on the ground. Even the road was not deliberately smoothed, and there was black mud when he stepped on it. The tribe was surrounded by low huts. The simple fences were useless to Soren. He could see the lower aborigines gathered in a mess. There were more than 5 or 6 members in a family. It gave him a feeling of an African tribe. Even if it had a history of thousands of years, there was no civilization at all. War, chaos and killing. The environment destroyed the hope of civilization. Only the oldest traditions and order were still maintained, and the Num rulers ruled these lower aborigines. The low huts formed a circle, and only the center of the tribe could be lit with relatively rare resin torches. Everything here was so primitive and barren. Soren could even see simple stone tools. Steel was also a very rare resource here, and it was mainly used for weapons and knives. However, he could see some bronze tools. The small indigenous tribes were basically quite primitive. Only the tribes that had established towns had many skills. In fact, life was far from as easy as you think. The most basic things were clothing, food, shelter, and transportation. Clothes were ranked before food. Perhaps in the more civilized mainland areas, clothes were something that could be bought with money, but there were not many transactions here. Soren saw a lot of lower aborigines who were not fully clothed. Many of the aborigines' children were basically sleeping with their buttocks naked. The clothes in the outer islands were mainly animal skins, linen, and other plant fibers. Animal skins were more valuable, and linen also needed to be planted and exchanged. If the location of the tribe was far away from the indigenous town, many of the most basic needs of life could not be met. Here, the finished cloth was something that could be used as money for transactions and consumption. Note, it was similar to the cloth used as a substitute currency in ancient China. Soren soon saw their food. Basically, as expected, it was a kind of black porridge mixed with vegetables, leaves and all kinds of other things. There was also a kind of ugly black bread on the side which was similar to a hard wooden stick. Soren could tell that they had plenty of food, but there wasn't much oil or water. Their food was messy as well because Soren saw a palm-sized spider. Most of the huts were like this. The inferior Aborigines lived in groups. Even if they were mating, they did not avoid children. The children here were considered adults when they were about 13 years old. Soren didn't stay for too long. He walked along the muddy road towards the center of the tribe. To be honest, Soren couldn't understand the thinking of the Aborigines. They had so much manpower, so why didn't they just clean up the road? Maybe they were used to this kind of living environment. Patrolling guards appeared in front of them. The ground near the center was actually paved with broken stones. Soren had just lurked nearby when he heard a series of rapid breathing, crashing sounds and moaning sounds, and they came from more than one place. Maybe it was because of the habit of working at sunrise and resting at sunrise. The Aborigines basically had no other entertainment at night. So their only entertainment at night was mating. As warriors with higher status in the tribe, they enjoyed more food, more resources and more mates. Everything in this area was much better than the outside. There were even decorative sculptures and smoked meat, salted fish, deer legs and so on hanging under the beams. The Aborigines living here were the warriors of the tribe. They were basically professionals and had strong fighting power. They were supported by the inferior Aborigines and had the right to speak in the tribe. The number of warriors was uncertain. But according to Soren's estimation, at least 5 people were needed to support one warrior. If this tribe didn't annex other tribes, at most there were about 300 warriors. In terms of numbers, they didn't pose much of a threat to Soren. Because he brought a lot of pirates with him, they could basically participate in the battle. However, there were a lot of old and weak women and children in this tribe. As he got closer and closer to the center, Soren inexplicably felt a sense of crisis. He carefully lurked closer and could see a few tall and majestic buildings. One of the buildings was very luxurious. Even the ground was covered with fur, and there were 2 tall Aborigines standing in front of the door. This should be the residence of the chief of the indigenous tribe. It seemed that the living conditions here were no worse than that of many generations of aristocrats. Soren could also hear the sound of maids walking around. Soren heard the sound of people and footsteps, but he was not sure what was going on inside. In addition to this luxurious residence, there was only a large courtyard nearby. The source of Soren's uneasiness was this courtyard. Judging from the strange statues placed in front of the door and all kinds of mysterious patterns, it was no surprise that this was the place where the shaman lived. Soren felt a weak fluctuation of magic, but he didn't dare to approach because the spellcaster could set up an alarm trap, and this trap was very difficult to remove. It was possible that if he approached slightly, the other party would directly use a magic trap to discover him. There was a very strong smell of medicine near the shaman's courtyard. A very, very strong smell of medicine. The smell was a little pungent and it made people feel a little uncomfortable. It was as if they would be poisoned if they stayed for too long. The nearby houses were quite far from here. It seemed that the other people in the tribe feared the shaman more than they respected him. There were a lot of strange plant roots and body parts near the courtyard. Soren couldn't identify most of them, but this didn't prevent him from confirming that the shaman inside was an expert in potions. At least in the branch of potions, toxicology, he was a first-class expert. The indigenous people were good at using poisons. This kind of knowledge was mainly in the hands of the shaman. They would pass on part of it, but the most important part was passed down orally by the shaman. Because of long-term exposure to potions, many of these shaman had poison resistance, and some even had a body that was directly immune to poison. They also had some abilities similar to dark witchcraft, including some strange curses. There was a row of trees near the courtyard. It was a kind of strange tree about 25 meters tall, and the leaves weren't very wide. It looked like a kind of arbor and the bark was white and gray. Soren glanced at it, and his expression gradually became serious. He quietly approached it, and then a throwing knife appeared in his palm out of thin air. This is... Soren carefully pierced a small hole in the trunk, and then carefully observed it. He only saw a trace of milky white liquid flowing out, and there seemed to be a faint fishy smell in the air. His expression was serious and he murmured, Throat sealing? Arrow poison wood? Throat sealing. It was a kind of naturally poisonous tree, and its name was arrow poison wood. It was a kind of tree that was commonly seen in tropical rainforests. When the milky white venom touched the wound, it would quickly paralyze the poisoned person's heart, seal the blood vessels, coagulate the blood, and finally suffocate to death. This kind of poison was very dangerous. If the dose of poison was relatively high, even an extraordinary body may not be able to withstand it. As for the ordinary pirates under Soren, if they were poisoned, they basically needed an antidote, and the probability of surviving was quite low. It seems that my decision was right. Soren couldn't help but have a cold sweat. He secretly rejoiced that he decided to come here personally today, and didn't recklessly let his men fight with the indigenous tribe. Otherwise, when the real fight began, the casualties of his men would definitely be quite heavy. Not to mention the indigenous people's other means, just the throat-sealing poison alone was enough to make many people suffer. Most of Soren's pirates would be dead before they could even see them summon their elemental spirits. It seems that I have to think about it at length. If I want to make a move, I have to catch them off guard. Soren's figure lurked in the darkness. He took a deep look at the courtyard in front of him, then turned and walked out of the tribe. The shaman here was a big problem. If he wanted to deal with the indigenous tribe, he had to carry out a decapitation operation. He and Vivian had to take the first step to get rid of the shaman. Although he couldn't determine the level of his profession, it shouldn't be higher than the 4th grade. Basically, there were very few legendary-level shamans in the outer islands. Even if there were, they would be in the large indigenous tribes with tens of thousands of people. This indigenous tribe seemed to have a lot of resources, whether it was population, land, or other materials. Even the arrow poison wood was of great use to Soren. Soren's trip this time. He confirmed the threat of this indigenous tribe, and also confirmed his determination to get rid of them. How could he allow others to sleep beside him? These indigenous people were so dangerous, Soren absolutely couldn't allow them to live on this island. Perhaps the indigenous people's attitude towards outsiders was similar, but because they didn't know Soren's background, they didn't rush to attack. Only one of them was destined to survive. P.S. I got up at 6:30 in the morning to write. Maybe I feel that the updates during this period of time are not good enough, so I have to quickly compensate you. Foot is Z, who is working hard to write. Today at 3 o'clock. Chapter 260. Port Tylon. In a tavern near the port, the half-elf first mate was sitting at the bar waiting. Next to him was a prostitute, but he was not interested in looking at her. There was a sign outside the tavern. The sign was painted with a great white shark. There were many people waiting outside. Many of them looked fierce, so ordinary people passing by did not dare to approach. About 10 minutes later, a skinny man came in. He looked around, then turned and went into the tavern. "How is it?" The half-elf first mate glanced at the skinny man who came in and said in a deep voice, "Have you found the person I need?" The skinny man quickly bowed his head and replied, "Because it's near the end of the year, many people have left here. Dwarves have been rare during this time. Maybe it's because of the City of Wealth, now the whole coastal area is a bit depressed." The half-elf first mate frowned and said, "I don't care what the reason is. The person I need must be found for me, or I will throw you into the sea to feed the fish." The skinny man heard the words and had a cold sweat on his forehead. He quickly said, "I will do it as soon as possible. I will do it as soon as possible. However, there are a lot of people who know how to make bricks, but it's very difficult to find someone who's proficient in it. I heard that some slaves were recently shipped from the east, among which there are craftsmen who know how to make porcelain. This batch of slaves seems to be sent here for some reason. Anyway, many people have received the news recently. Some of them will be sent to the City of Wealth for auction, and the other will be sent to the Principality of Rossard." The half-elf first mate showed a look of interest and said slowly, "Eastern slaves? Porcelain?" "Yes." The skinny man quickly nodded and said, "Among the slaves sent from the east, there are many craftsmen who know how to make porcelain. It seems that something big happened over there. Many Easterners were demoted to slaves. Since these people even know how to make such exquisite porcelain, it should be no problem to make simple bricks and tiles. They should be able to meet your requirements." "Porcelain? Slaves?" The half-elf first mate raised his hand and touched his chin as if he was thinking about something. He said slowly, "It seems to be useful. Where are they? You also have to find me the dwarf who built the furnace. You know His Excellency Throatcutter's temper. If he is unhappy because things are done too slowly, I'm afraid another batch of heads will be cut off in Port Tylon." The skinny man quickly nodded and left after saying a few more words. After he left, the half-elf first mate raised his hand and beckoned to the scarred man next to him. He then ordered, "Go to Snake Island to gather people and prepare a batch of fast boats. Those craftsmen will definitely be useful. Let's go and grab them." They were pirates. Pirates spent money to buy things because they had moral integrity. Robbing them was their professional ethics. Scarface's subordinate quickly nodded and left. The half-elf first mate nodded with satisfaction, and then began to think about how to take down the slaves with the least casualties and the fastest speed. His Excellency Throat Cutter recently needed a lot of labor, and this batch of Eastern slaves seemed to be very valuable. At the other side, after the skinny man left the tavern, he quickly made his way into an alley. He entered from a back door and came to a room. Outside the room, there was a powerful female Amazon warrior guarding. Inside there was a woman with a scar on her face and a dagger. She glanced at the skinny man who came in and asked, "How is it?" "Looks like he took the bait." The skinny man quickly bowed his head. The Amazon woman with a scar on the side of her face showed a smile and said playfully, "Very good. That batch of goods is secretly controlled by the pirate king Ashrod. As long as this group of throat cutters men snatch the goods, their conflicts will soon become more and more intense. The pirate king Ashrod has long felt threatened and dissatisfied with the rise of throat cutter. Now he should make a move, right?" The skinny man quickly nodded and hesitated for a moment before saying, "But that batch of goods seems to have more than just some slaves transported by the way, right? Some of the things in it are very valuable. I'm afraid that they will benefit in the end. And I'm afraid that Ashrod can also guess the information we revealed to them." The Amazon woman looked at him contemptuously and said slowly, "It's just 50 or 60,000 kindlers' goods. If it can make the two pirate kings fight, it's worth paying a little price. That man thinks that he can run rampant on the sea with the support of the Naga royal family behind him. It's not the first time he has done things secretly behind the Sea Temple's back. Now we just have to sit back and reap the benefits." The skinny man didn't speak, but his expression was inexplicably worried. Instigating the struggle between the two pirate kings on the south coast would definitely put a little pressure on him. As long as either side knew, his end would be very miserable. Now he only hoped that after they fought, no one would be in the mood to pay attention to a small character like him. The Outer Islands. Soren returned to the camp at dawn. Vivian seemed to have not slept all night. After feeling that he was back, she closed her eyes sleepily. The little girl was worried that Soren would be in danger. Because she had used limited wishing, the two of them had a telepathic ability. She was ready to teleport at any time when Soren was in danger. Now that Soren was back, she was naturally relieved. The little girl, who had been very sleepy during this time, quickly fell asleep. It was really enviable. The little girl slept most of the time every day, but her strength grew faster than Soren. It was as if sleeping could improve her combat power. After Soren came back, he immediately became busy. On the one hand, he strengthened his vigilance. On the other hand, he also studied how to uproot the indigenous tribes. There were two most troublesome problems in dealing with the indigenous tribes. The first was the spirit that they worshipped and sacrificed. Most of the spirits had legendary combat power, and there was more than one spirit. If the tribe maintained the worship of the ancestors, then the number of spirits might be more. The most powerful of them was probably above the legendary level. The other souls were directly transformed into souls after the death of the high-grade warriors in the tribe. This kind of existence was a bit like the war spirit. It was more common in totemic areas, and it was a common situation in the far north and Iceland. Souls were a bit similar to holy spirits. Both had a weak divine power. It was not that easy to deal with souls. Anything that was related to the power of the gods was not easy to deal with. Even if Soren and Vivian worked together, it would be more troublesome to deal with the souls sacrificed by the indigenous tribes for generations. Secondly, the Aborigines were proficient in the use of poisons and medicines. Whether it was the blow darts that could force people to faint or the poisons and liquids that could be smeared on weapons, these things were quite dangerous and troublesome. Moreover, the speed of these poisons was quite fast. Once you were poisoned, you would fall to the ground in a short time. Soren had a headache dealing with them, not to mention the other pirates. This was the most troublesome thing in the Outer Islands. There were too many poisonous things here. With a little knowledge of potions, it was easy to find the poison things here. Soren frowned and thought, his fingers gently stroking the table. At this moment, the sky was already bright. Because Soren ordered to lift the ban on alcohol and let the pirate minions celebrate the new year, the whole camp was now in a celebratory atmosphere. No matter how fierce the pirates were, they were still humans and humans would certainly have some other emotions. There was no need for decorations for the new year, but a bonfire had to be set up. Large bowls of wine and large pieces of meat were also necessary. Some of the pirates were prepared to hunt, and some were prepared to go out and fish for seafood. Many of the pirates were fishermen and sailors. Recently, the pirate minions had a little understanding of Soren's eating habits. They knew that the throat cutter liked seafood such as sea cucumbers, shark fins, lobsters and so on. Even the king crab, which was rarely eaten, was quite liked by him. Many seafood actually had a strong fishy smell. In this era, spices were very expensive. Many people directly boiled the seafood they caught, and there was basically no seasoning. A group of pirates was ready to go to the sea. They planned to catch some rare seafood and bring it back to Soren. But at this moment, suddenly there was a trace of a ship in the distance. It did not look like a warship and there was no flag on it. The pirate leader under Soren still knew the severity of the situation. After seeing the ship in the distance, he immediately ordered his minions to go back and report. Then they sent out a fast boat and rowed towards the approaching ship in the distance, ready to inquire about the identity of the other party. But it seemed that they did not need to ask, because the pirate leader had just approached and recognized who the person in front of him was. The other party had two obvious characteristics, such as black skin, silver-white hair, and scarlet pupils. Drows. Strictly speaking, they should be half-drows of mixed blood. Standing on the bow was the drow warrior that Soren let go. Behind him was a whole team of drow warriors. Although their equipment looked a little worse and many of them had some traces of damage, they were much stronger than the pirates. The pirate leader in front of him was stunned for a moment, but he did not stop them to ask. He just let the team of drows in front of him go ashore. On this day, after waiting for more than a month, Soren finally received a response from the drows. However, the time was much later than he expected. Chapter 261. The City of Wealth. The shadows left by the chaos and killings that happened some time ago have not yet dissipated, and the city was still a bit deserted. There were not many pedestrians on the streets, and now a lot of trade has turned to Shipwreck Bay. So much so that the life of the lower class of the City of Wealth has become difficult. In the past, there were endless jobs to be found on the docks at this time, but now the docks had to be picky. Many families who relied on selling coolies to live were now very poor. Especially because of the arrival of the new year and the spread of chaos within the mainland, the gradually increasing food prices made them even more miserable. Many people have regretted it. Many people lost their relatives and friends that night, but after that night they found that they lost more than that. The paladins left. They actually succeeded in changing the place and reducing the evil here, but they did not let the poor live the life they wanted because they were weak and the weak were so fragile after the chaos. The gang forces in the City of Wealth have been reduced a lot. Many gangs were destroyed that night, but the destroyed gangs left a lot of empty spaces, and too many bloody incidents have occurred in the fight for these interests. From that day until now, the curfew in the City of Wealth has not been lifted, and there are many guards patrolling every day. The temple also seemed a bit silent. They don't seem to have any plans to do anything about the City of Wealth that is gradually losing its former prosperity. Maybe they have already done something or made other decisions. No one knows what the temple is planning. Maybe they don't care about this temporary depression, but for the poor at the bottom, they only know that life is getting harder and harder. Food prices are still rising, work opportunities are getting fewer and fewer, and the merchants who come here no longer provide economic consumption. Even the business of prostitutes and female prostitutes has begun to deteriorate a lot. In the past, 2 silver thalers could get a pretty prostitute, but now 1 silver thaler could be played twice, and even let her open her mouth to taste the flute for a while. At the corner of the street, 2 shop owners with some sad faces sat together. One of the chubby shop owners raised his hand to wipe his sweat and complained, "I heard that there is going to be a war in the south. Recently the price of goods has increased by 30%, and there are fewer things being shipped from the south. I heard that some trade routes have been cut off. I also heard that the Red Dragon appeared in Whiterun, and now everyone is in a panic." The other shop owner, who was skinnier, also sighed and said slowly, "That's not too bad. We could have taken the sea route. But now, after such a commotion, many merchants did not dare to come over. I heard that there's a pirate king named Throat Cutter in Port Tylon and Shipwreck Bay. He's different from the previous pirate kings. He doesn't like to take his men to rob, and he restricts others from acting recklessly. Now, many merchants are running to these 2 places." The fat shop owner was stunned for a moment before he asked, "Not robbing? Then where would his money come from?" There are many pirates who make a living on the sea. If they don't rob, won't they all have to starve? The skinny shop owner looked outside and replied, I'm not sure either. But there must be other ways to earn money. It was said that some of the pirate leaders had changed professions and started a caravan. In addition to the filial piety on the surface of the sea, it would definitely be enough to feed a group of subordinates. Besides, most of the trade on the south coast was supported by the outer islands. That's a lot of money. TSK, one ticket is enough for us to earn in 2 or 3 years. That's right. I heard during this period of time that His Excellency Throat Cutter did not rob merchants at all. Recently, Port Tylon and Shipwreck Bay have heard that they are selling flags. It's a big black flag. It's said that pirates on the sea will not attack merchant ships if they hang it up. Those who don't hang flags are a bit uncertain. Anyway, I'm not too sure. The world has changed too fast recently. Something will happen every few days. I've been very worried recently. I'm wondering if I should sell my shop, and then make some preparations to go back to the manor in the countryside. The two men kept chatting and they talked too much about recent events. Suddenly, they seemed to have heard a scream and then their whole body shivered. There was a lot of chaos during this period of time. The day before yesterday, someone was hacked to death in front of their shop in the middle of the night. The two men did not dare to go over when they heard the sound. Instead, they hurriedly called the patrol guards. It took about 10 minutes for the guards to come over. There was no movement in the alley where the sound came from. However, this was also good. People who didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, and didn't know anything could live longer. As soon as they entered the alley, even the patrol guards could not help but take a deep breath. There were many corpses inside. One of the guard captains with a beard and full body armor turned over and looked at the corpses. The expression on his face suddenly became serious. He looked around and said, It's a very powerful master. These corpses were all killed in one blow. The time of death was less than a minute. Such a powerful master has probably crossed that threshold. This is not something we can control. Let's report it and let the higher-ups deal with it. There were 12 corpses on the ground. All of them were killed in one blow. The time of death was less than a minute. The last scream seemed to be because of something else. Otherwise there was no movement at all. This was already the combat power of a legendary level. Not to mention that the guard captain just took a look and found that there were adventurers with similar skills as him among the corpses. 3 of them were at least grade 3 professions. The matter was quickly reported, but it was hard to say whether anyone would care about it next. On the other side, on a hidden beam, a young man in a cloak sat in the corner of the house. He was playing with a golden gold coin in his hand. His expression seemed to be a little excited. The gold coin in his hand was quite special. It was not in the style of Kindler. There was no portrait of the Lady of Riches on it. Instead, it was engraved with the image of another goddess. There were strange patterns on the front and back of the gold coin. Many of them could not be understood at all, but it did not affect people who saw it at first sight. The young man stood up, picked up the gold coin, and smiled in the direction of the sea. My luck is really good. This time, not only did I get a big order, but I also happened to meet someone who found the legendary lucky gold coin in the underground ruins. It seems that the Lady of Luck is really looking after me this time. Throat Cutter? If I kill you, I will have a big harvest this time. Chapter 262. From the desolate desert to the east, across the boundless Gobi, into the fortress surrounded by mountains. A young man in tattered armor was walking alone. He had just finished a battle and dealt with an ogre that was wandering nearby. At this moment he was wiping the blood on his sword, then he put his sword back into the scabbard and walked toward the fortress surrounded by mountains. The fortress was built halfway up the mountain. It was undoubtedly very time-consuming to build at such a height and in such an environment. This place seemed to have a very long history. Just by looking at it, one could feel the vicissitudes of the fortress. There were some black marks on the walls, which were the blood that seeped into the rocks and finally became what it was now. The young man took a deep breath and then slowly stepped into the fortress. No one seemed to be surprised by his arrival, and no one stopped him from entering. He walked all the way to the center of the fortress. There were 6 marble pillars in the hall, and there were almost no other decorations. There were some relief paintings on the walls and it looked quite empty. At the front of the long table sat a rather burly man. He had a standard square face, a strong heroic spirit, clean short hair, thick eyebrows, and a rather sharp gaze. The man was wearing heavy armor and had a 2-handed heavy sword on his knees. When he heard the footsteps of others, he could not help but raise his head slightly and put down the quill in his hand. In front of him were piles of scrolls, which were almost a meter thick. Many of them had been flipped through and put aside. It seemed that he had been sitting here for a long time. Next to him was the food he had eaten at noon, which was just very simple bread and soup. "You're here." The burly man stood up. He was probably more than 2 meters tall, much taller than the young man in front of him. He put down the quill pen in his hand and also put down the book in his hand. His sharp and heroic eyes stared at the young man in front of him. Time did not leave too many traces on his face, but his chiseled and resolute face still made others feel the traces of time he had experienced. This was a profession above legendary. Powerful strength had transformed his bloodline, and his lifespan was much longer than ordinary people. The young man knelt down on one knee and humbly lowered his head. He held the top of the sword hilt and said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency, Judge." The burly man didn't answer. He just quietly looked at the young man in front of him. After a while he slowly walked down and came to the front of this former Saint Samurai. He pulled out his sword and placed it on his shoulder. He said in a deep voice, "Since you have the qualifications to come to me, it proves that you have passed all the previous tests. I don't know what you've been through, what you've seen, or what you've understood. None of this is important to me. The important thing is that from today onwards, you have to learn to look at the world from a different perspective. Now, I want to teach you your first lesson." The tall and sturdy man picked up a heavy book and handed it to the young man in front of him, saying in a sonorous voice, "Justice, either by force or by law. From today onwards, you will follow me and learn all the laws of the continent. Once you've learned all the laws, I'll teach you how to use force to seek justice. Young people, you have to remember that force is always the last resort. You have to learn to use your wisdom before using force. The law is also our most effective weapon, even if we have to use force to maintain the law in the end." Judge. A former Saint Samurai who was almost forgotten by history. Many people had completely forgotten this legendary Saint Samurai. However, if Soren were present, he would recognize that the tall and sturdy man in front of him was a more powerful and special existence than the Silver Hand. Not many people still remembered his past, but Soren knew that he was one of the few legendary professions in the world who had the ability to fight against powerful gods. He was also the only Saint Samurai who dared to draw his sword against the God of Light. The City of Wealth. In a dark basement, a woman with a grimace mask frowned and shouted coldly at the others below, "What? The lucky gold coins were stolen? You bunch of useless trash. Hurry up and get them back for me." The angry voice was like a cold wind blowing, making the others below tremble. One of the men couldn't help but muster up his courage and whisper, "Your Excellency, please calm down. According to the prophecy, we must gather all 12 lucky gold coins to unlock the secret of that place. We still have time. We must have time to get the lucky gold coins back." The woman with the grimace mask looked at him coldly and said slowly, "I'll give you half a year. If you can't get the lucky gold coins back after half a year, then you can talk to His Excellency the Saint in person." Lucky gold coins. A legendary special item that was said to bring good luck to people. There were a total of 12 lucky gold coins. The front was engraved with the oldest goddess of luck, not the current goddess of luck. The back was engraved with 12 astrological signs, representing different meanings. There were very few records about the lucky gold coins. It was only known that they could bring good luck. However, there was also a special legend. It was said that after gathering all 12 lucky gold coins, one could find the 13th gold coin that represented misfortune and bad luck. This was a very ancient artifact. Could even be used to curse the gods. It was an artifact made by the goddess of luck for self-protection. The Outer Islands. Soren didn't have much joy on his face for the appearance of the drow warrior, because the other party arrived much later than he expected. According to his original plan, the drow should have arrived before he set off for the Outer Islands, instead of waiting until he had set up a camp in the Outer Islands. A team of drow warriors appeared in the distance. Although their equipment was a bit shabby, their momentum was very strong. There were only 31 drows, but their neat pace and cold eyes were more shocking than hundreds of pirates. These drow warriors were easy to associate with the elven army in The Lord of the Rings. Among the warriors of many races, the discipline of the elves was the best, and among all the elves, the rule of the drow army was the most cruel and ruthless. The training time of an elven warrior was quite long, far more time-consuming than that of warriors of other races. So in terms of quality in all aspects, the elven army was one of the best. As for the drow warriors, they were even stricter. The training they received was far more than that of other races. All of them were professions above grade 3. Soren just glanced at the drow warriors in front of him and inferred their abilities. Almost all of them had the combat power of a pirate leader. This kind of combat power could be a patrol captain in a city on the surface, but in the Underdark they could only be a more elite patrol guard. They were not even qualified to apply to be a petrified lizard knight. It seemed that their race had weakened a lot. Soren couldn't see many grade 4 drow warriors among them. The strict standard for a drow warrior in the Underdark was a profession level of 15. Your Excellency. The leader of the drow warriors seemed to intend to show his strength. After stopping, he turned around. The drow warriors behind him also turned around neatly at the same time. There was no movement during this period. Everyone seemed to be one. This might seem very shocking and oppressive to the pirates, but Soren was used to it. In his previous life, the discipline of military parades was child's play. Perhaps their fighting power was not as good as these drow warriors, but in terms of formation he had seen more shocking things. Soren nodded indifferently and said slowly, "The others stay outside. You come in with me. I have something to talk to you about." These drow warriors came at the right time. Soren just needed such a group of thugs. P.S. I'm a little slow today. I can only write 2 chapters. Chapter 263. The sky gradually darkened. Darkblade did not look very good when he walked out of the hall. The drow warriors he brought had been settled in another residence. When he returned, there were already people waiting for him. These drows did not seem to be completely at ease with Soren. They were still fully armed after settling down, just waiting quietly for the return of their leader. Drows were very suspicious intelligent creatures. It was difficult for them to trust others in a short time. "How is it?" A young-looking drow warrior stood up and asked, "Lord Darkblade, what did that lord say?" Darkblade looked at the others and noticed that they also wanted to know what Lord Darkblade asked for. In the end, he could only sigh helplessly. "He wants us to serve him and fight for him. As long as we can do this, the tribe can get a steady stream of supplies. He even promised to let us move here to live." These words made many people silent. At first glance, it sounded like a good condition, but after careful consideration, it was suspicious of annexation. The drows did not want to be controlled by a human. Cooperation was the limit they could accept at present. Unless Soren was so powerful that they could not resist or refuse, and could easily erase their existence. Before coming here, the female priests had made a decision. In fact, the group of women was still a little disgusted and distrustful of human beings. Otherwise, the leader would not be a male drow. It was important to know that males were naturally inferior to females among the drows. Lord Darkblade. A young drow warrior hesitated and said slowly, "Didn't we think this would happen before we came? After all, there is no free food in the world. He will definitely need us to pay something. If it's just fighting for him, it's not a big deal for us. After all, it's not the first time we've dealt with the natives." What was the most abundant in the outer islands? The natives. This group of drows had fought with the natives more than once or twice. Basically, in the outer islands, where the living environment was slightly better and the surrounding materials and food were richer, there would be large or small native tribes. They had mastered many ways to deal with the indigenous people in this cruel environment. After all, they were drows, which were equally dangerous and evil creatures. Even if they gave up their faith in the Queen of Spiders, there was still a trace of cunning and cruelty in the nature of the drows. "I know." Darkblade looked at the others and slowly said, "But this lord wants to directly attack and destroy the aboriginal tribe." His words caused a huge uproar. The other drows could not help but widen their eyes and murmur, "Master Darkblade, didn't you tell His Excellency what was in the indigenous tribe? Those spirits are rather difficult to deal with, and they don't have bodies of flesh and blood. When we first encountered them, we suffered heavy losses. With the pirates in the camp, it's basically impossible to defeat the spirits, unless there's a relatively powerful spell caster. The drows had also fought against the native spirits. However, there was no doubt that they had failed. It was because they were not strong enough and also because there were too many enemies. Without the power of the adepts and priests, it was very difficult for a group of powerful melee warriors to kill the half-energy soul lifeforms. Right. Spirits were immune to any attack from non-rare weapons. If it was a spirit with the power of a demigod, it would be immune to any rare weapon attack below grade 3. Its immunity was not much different from that of a demigod lich, but it did not have the powerful physical damage reduction ability of a demigod lich. After all, a lich's body was just a skeleton. In the entire camp, if they encountered a demigod spirit, except for Soren's legendary curved sword, Icing Death, no other weapon could hurt it. One could imagine how passive this group of drows with simple equipment was at that time. It was almost a one-sided situation when facing the spirits. In many cases there was no way around it. It was like if you didn't have Dragon Slayer equipment, sometimes you couldn't break the defense of a giant dragon. I've said it. Dark Blade looked at the others and said in a deep voice, but His Excellency's attitude was quite firm, and I didn't dare to reject him obviously. After all, you know the situation of the tribe now. It's definitely not a wise choice to anger a pirate king. But fortunately, the indigenous tribes here are much weaker than the ones we encountered. The population is estimated to be only more than 1,000. According to the customs of the indigenous people who participate in hunting are considered warriors, there should only be about 300 people who can fight. The indigenous warriors did not participate in farming or labor. In addition to regular hunting and fighting, they were all supported by the lower-level indigenous people. The leader of the drows looked at the others and said slowly, His Excellency said that he was sure to deal with the spirits, so our task is to assist the pirates to deal with the indigenous people. There was a short silence. A drow's warrior who looked not young stood up and said in a deep voice, If His Excellency can deal with the spirits, we are not afraid of those indigenous people. According to the time, it's almost time for the antelopes and horned zebras to migrate. During this time, all the indigenous tribes are hunting. The source of meat for next spring depends on this hunt. So they should not launch an attack for the time being. Maybe we can choose a good time to attack them. If we are lucky, the casualties will be reduced a lot. The outer islands were a bit similar to Africa. Many of the islands here were scattered, but there were also connected islands because it used to be a continental shelf. The creatures in the jungle also had the habit of migrating north and south. When migration occurred, the number of herds would be quite large. Sometimes they would encounter migrating elephant herds. This was the hunting season for the indigenous tribes. Most of their meat for the coming year came from here. The indigenous people would use sea salt to cure the meat, which could be maintained for a long time until the next autumn's fishing season. The fishing season was the migration of fish. Sturgeon, swordfish, striped fish, and so on would go to warm areas to reproduce every autumn and return to areas near the north in the spring of the next year. During this period, the number of fish was quite spectacular. You could see a large number of fish on the migration route of the fish with the naked eye. Simply put, you could catch dozens of fat fish by throwing a big net down. And because the fishermen did not hunt much, these fish were very clumsy and could be speared with a harpoon. In some ways, the resources of the outer islands were indeed very rich. Knowledge geography. The outer islands as a whole are a narrow island-connected area. The length reaches the scale of the continental shelf, but the width is less than 1/10. The edge of the Gulf Islands will extend to the extreme north, and eventually close to the Great Glacier that stretches for thousands of miles. On the other side, Soren walked back and forth in the hall, then looked up at his men in front of him and said, Pay attention to the drows. If there are any changes, tell me immediately. Yes. A scarred man immediately responded and left. Just as the drows could not fully trust Soren, Soren did not fully trust them because he had dealt with the drows more than once or twice. He knew a lot about these intelligent creatures that were cunning by nature. If you wanted to control the drows, you either had power or benefits. Otherwise they would easily betray you. Soren closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then said, No female drows appeared and no spellcasters were seen. Has this group of drows declined to such a state, or have they still not decided to fully cooperate with me? If it's because of me, their value will be greatly reduced. A group of drows that has lost their spellcaster inheritance has no future. If it's the latter, then they still feel repulsed by me. I'm afraid they can only cooperate because they have no other choice. I must have great power to completely tame them, right? This group of drows was very valuable. If they were included in Soren's plan, it could achieve twice the result with half the effort. Besides, the drows were naturally suited to do some shady things. Soren had many means that the pirates might not be able to do, but these drows could definitely do it. He must capture these drows in his hands. P.S. Today's update. Chapter 264. The sky was just starting to brighten. Soren had already woken up. He washed up and went to the training ground outside his room to stretch his muscles. Soren's mastery of sword forms had once again entered a period of accumulation. He was now practicing the White Raven tactics. It was much harder to master compared to sword forms. He had been practicing it for a few months, but he still hadn't made much progress. Under normal circumstances, it would take 3 to 5 years to master a portion of these high-level combat skills. Sword forms belong to a single attack, while the White Raven tactics belong to a set of attacks. It was like the difference between a powerful sword form and a set of powerful sword forms. There were also techniques for explosive power, techniques for accumulating power, and techniques for combining attacks. These things required specialized training and mastering the corresponding skills. For example, Soren couldn't immediately use sword form decapitation after using heavy slash. Only sword saints could master these techniques. There were many combat skills that only they could use. Soren exercised for a while and the sky gradually brightened. He took out a 3-shot crossbow and quickly loaded it with ammunition. He then fired at a target 100 meters away. The distance wasn't too far, but it wasn't too close either. Soren didn't even aim. He just raised his hand and fired at the target. With his current strength and attributes, he didn't need to aim. His accuracy was quite high. All attribute abilities extended to various fields, so attribute abilities were also the most difficult to improve. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. All 3 arrows hit the target and all of them hit the bullseye. However, there was no trace of pride on Soren's face because this was just the simplest shooting skill. This kind of skill was nothing in the eyes of many people. He calmly continued to load the crossbow and ran from left to right. He moved at an astonishing speed and at the same time he fired at the target in the distance. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. All 3 arrows hit the target, but this time only one of them hit the bullseye. Soren looked at the target in front of him and couldn't help but frown slightly. He hadn't mastered any skills in long-range shooting. It wasn't easy to hit the target while moving at high speed. He had to rely on his strong dexterity attributes, balance, coordination, hit rate, etc. However, this was really nothing. A true expert could directly shoot the heart of the target while moving at high speed while the enemy was also moving at high speed. Only then could he be considered a true godly archer. If it was a sharpshooter according to the standards of ordinary people, then most of the elves who were good at crossbows could do it. The conditions were still not enough. Without modern training equipment, high-speed shooting had to be mastered in actual combat. Soren played with the 3-shot crossbow in his hand. Then he loaded it and fired. There was a burst of applause in the distance, and then the drow that Soren had let go came over. His name was Dark Blade Andri. He was a master of combat among the drow and the leader of the drow warriors. There were 2 people behind the drow warrior. He looked at Soren in front of him and bowed slightly. He then praised, "Your skills are amazing." Was a little fake. Soren knew his shooting skills, but his face didn't change at all. He just smiled and said, "It's just a casual practice. Drows are the masters of shooting." Dark Blade Andri smiled and then said, "Do you like to use crossbows?" "Yes." Soren frowned slightly. He didn't quite understand why the other party said this. The leader of the drow warriors in front of him glanced at the target in the distance, then lowered his head slightly and said, "In my opinion, with your strength, you shouldn't use such a heavy and slow crossbow at all. Only some people who are not talented enough are suitable to use a crossbow because it takes too long to load, and its power is not stronger than a bow. From my personal point of view, your strength, agility, and physical fitness are far superior to others. From the perspective of an archer, you are a genius in using a bow." Genius? Soren couldn't help but show a thoughtful expression. In terms of attributes, he did have quite enough attributes to use a bow. It was just that he had always used a crossbow before, and it had become a habit, so he almost never thought about switching to a bow. Until today, when the leader of the drow warriors in front of him mentioned it, Soren realized that with his current attributes, using a bow might be better than using a crossbow. "Come." Dark Blade Andri turned around and looked behind him, then ordered, "Bring me my elven war bow." One of his subordinates quickly left. After a while he came back with a dark golden elven war bow. The surface of the bow was very smooth and there were exquisite carvings on it. It looked like it was painted with some kind of dye, but Soren wasn't too sure what it was. This elven war bow was not an ordinary item at first glance. In fact, all elven war bows were not ordinary items. They were at least +1 rare grade weapons. This was because the bows made by the elves were more sophisticated than those made by humans. The craftsmanship and materials used could not be compared. Elven war bow, +2, rare grade item. Dark Blade Andri handed the elven war bow in his hand to Soren and said slowly, "Why don't you try this war bow? Maybe you will find that a bow is more effective than a crossbow." Soren reached out and took the elven war bow. In the past, his way of fighting was to fill the crossbow with ammunition in advance, and then throw it away when the battle was over. In fact, Soren rarely filled the crossbow with ammunition continuously in battle. He only used it as a one-time consumable. However, today the words of the drows in front of him had attracted his attention. He also wanted to test the lethality of the elven war bow. The follower next to him quickly brought over a quiver full of arrows. Soren stood about 120 meters away from the target, then reached out and picked up an arrow. He smoothly knocked the arrow on the bow and shot it at the target. He didn't use the bow much, but it was not that he was completely unfamiliar with it. It was just that it was not as convenient to shoot as a crossbow. After all, a crossbow could be fired after it was loaded, but there was a process of knocking the arrow on the bow. However, the continuity of shooting with a bow was undoubtedly much better than with a crossbow. Swoosh! A sharp arrow was released, and Soren easily hit the bull's eye. His strength wasn't high, but his dexterity was 24 points. This meant that Soren's balance and coordination were very good. He was very outstanding in anything related to skill. This arrow didn't mean anything. Soren was just trying out his skills. When he got a feel for it, he raised his hand and took the quiver, then he continuously shot at the target in front of him. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 5 arrows were shot out in succession. Soren's shooting speed was quite fast. Although his strength wasn't very high, his endurance was quite good. It took him about a second to aim and shoot. In other words, he shot continuously for 5 seconds at the target at a rate of 1 arrow per second. In the next moment, 5 arrows pierced through the air and hit the bullseye in the distance. He didn't seem to be unaccustomed to using a bow. Perhaps it was because of the omnipotent hands, his accuracy was very high when he aimed and shot. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Soren didn't stop at all. He had a total of 30 arrows in his quiver. He shot 10 arrows at each target, which took him about 36 seconds. During this period of time, he didn't need to rest, and he didn't have any stamina that couldn't keep up with the consumption. When he finished shooting all the arrows in his quiver, he felt a slight numbness in his arm. The targets in the distance were full of arrows. Soren basically didn't miss the target, but only 27 arrows hit the bull's eye. 3 of them didn't hit the bull's eye. From the angle of aiming and shooting, this result should be considered pretty good. The drow next to him was slightly surprised. On the other hand, Soren looked at the targets in the distance that were full of arrows and couldn't help but fall into deep thought. He seemed to have overlooked something in the past. Perhaps the crossbow wasn't suitable for him. Chapter 265. Soren needed a long-range attack. Because in the past he often followed a team, but now he was mainly alone. Wizards had too few spell slots. It was unrealistic to rely on spell slots for long-range attacks unless one was a high-grade wizard. Soren used to use a crossbow, but now he thought that a bow was more suitable for him. However, there was also a limitation to this equipment. That was, to use the bow, he must carry a quiver on his back. At the same time, if there was a close combat, the bow must be carried on his back. In that case, a turn would be fatal. One could imagine rolling and dodging with a bow on his back. In some ways, a bow was not as convenient as a crossbow. But Soren did not have these concerns, because he had a piece of equipment that he had never had before. It was the Battlemaster gloves. As long as he had this equipment, he could switch weapons at any time. Using a crossbow was as convenient as using a bow. He could take out and put back the bow at any time, and then take out his curved sword to fight in close combat. In other words, this equipment solved the problem of Soren using a bow before, and it also perfectly solved the problem of the bow affecting his performance in close combat. Soren found another way to fight, but he was not in a hurry to change his way of fighting. The reason was simple. Using a bow required a considerable amount of skill, and at the same time, it also required the support of a variety of abilities. He only had high attributes and did not have any abilities. Maybe he could deal with ordinary people, but it would be difficult for him to hit the enemy with a high-grade profession. If he wanted to use a bow to fight, he at least needed to master the abilities of precise shooting, moving shooting, and eagle eye. Very interesting. Soren returned the elven bow in his hand to the drow in front of him and nodded slightly. Your suggestion is very good. It is indeed useful to me. Dark Blade bowed slightly, but he did not reach out to take the elven bow. Instead, he bowed his head and said, "That would be my pleasure. Your Excellency, I think this bow is more suitable for you. In the future, you will be able to exert its greatest power. Please accept it." Soren smiled slightly when he heard this. He nodded and put it away. It was a grade 2 extraordinary bow. Moreover, it was an elven war bow. Although it was not as valuable as legendary equipment, it was still relatively rare. At the moment, there was not enough special wood to make bows, short bows, long bows, and so on. Most of them were +1 rare grade items. This was similar to the enhanced crossbow. Tier 2 extraordinary ranged weapons were already relatively rare, and Tier 3 extraordinary ranged weapons were even rarer. The most powerful crossbow Soren had ever seen was a +3 heart-piercing bow. He had heard of legendary crossbows before, but he had never seen one before. The increase in the power of the crossbow was mainly due to the arrows and bolts. Item type: Elven War Bow, +2, item grade: Rare, grade 2. Item description: This is an elven war bow with a certain history. It was made with wood from the ancient war tree and took 3 years to make. It has tenacity and durability far surpassing other war bows. The surface of the war bow was engraved with strange patterns. This was the symbol of enchantment, but it was unknown why the maker did not complete the enchantment process. At the bottom of the war bow, there was a sword mark that had been repaired. Its history was unknown, but it was still a powerful elven war bow. Requirements: 12 ST. A strength requirement +2. Weapon effect: hard bow, continuous shot, +2 penetration, +1 armor break. It seemed like this elven war bow had some history. Soren looked at it and was slightly surprised. If this elven war bow was completed, it should have its own name, but it seemed like it was not completed for some reason. He touched the engravings on the body of the bow. They did look like engravings left behind by enchantment, but since it was not completed, it was only a grade 2 elven war bow. This weapon is not bad. It even has the effect of armor break. Soren looked at it and thought to himself, the power of the bow mainly depends on the arrow. Although there are no explosive arrows or frost arrows in the outer islands, there are a lot of tools that are dipped in poison. As long as we destroy the indigenous tribe, we can directly use the poison on the arrows in the future. It should not be a problem to mass-produce poisoned arrows. The blow darts used by the indigenous people could reach +3 extraordinary level. If they used their poison skills to make arrows, they might be able to make +3 poisoned arrows. Then, with the help of the elven war bow, the power would be more terrifying. It would definitely be more useful than many spells. At this time, the sky was already bright, and many people had already woken up. Soren just wanted to say something, but he saw a one-eyed pirate coming from outside. He carefully walked to Soren's side and said respectfully, "Your Excellency, it's ready." "Okay." Soren nodded. He looked at the leader of the drow warriors in front of him and said in a deep voice, "We'll attack tonight. Tell your people to get ready." "So fast?" Dark Blade hesitated, but he still nodded and said, "Yes. I'll arrange it now." Soren smiled with satisfaction, then waved his hand to summon one of his men. He whispered a few words in his ear, and then said a few words to the one-eyed pirate. Immediately the two men ran in different directions. Soon the camp began to operate. All the elite pirates under the pirate leaders gathered, but they did not enter the jungle area. Instead they all went to the port and boarded the warships outside. There was a river on this island that led to the sea. They could approach the indigenous tribe from the estuary. In the room. When Soren walked in, Vivian was already dressed and waiting for him. When she saw him come in, the little girl smiled sweetly, but her expression was a little excited. She said in a clear voice, "Brother, let's go. Kill all those nasty aborigines." Today Vivian was wearing a black princess dress. For some reason the little girl liked to wear black and white princess dresses recently. She rarely wore other clothes. Maybe it was because he gradually got used to the little girl's gradually changing clothes. Soren did not feel strange in his heart. He just nodded slightly and said, "Do you remember all the things I taught you? The most important thing for a spellcaster is to protect yourself. Remember not to be too impulsive. Our goal is those souls. As long as we kill the souls, we can deal with the other indigenous people at any time." The souls were the key to everything. Because whether it was for Soren or Vivian, killing the souls could increase their divine power. As long as the souls were killed, the threat of the indigenous people would be reduced by half, and they could deal with them at any time in the future. Moreover, Soren had now accumulated 9 divinity points. As long as he casually killed a soul with divinity, he could accumulate 10 divinity points and get the buff of minor divinity. At that time, Soren's all attributes would be +1, which was equivalent to an additional 6 points of total attributes. This was quite a huge increase in combat power. Hearing Soren's order, Vivian nodded obediently and then said cheerfully, "Brother, when are we leaving? I can't wait to show off my skills." He did not know why. Soren felt that the little girl was more belligerent than before, but he still liked this change. Because as the Avatar crisis was getting closer and closer, Soren's pressure in his heart was increasing, especially when the future enemies were likely to be gods. He might not be able to protect Vivian's safety at all times, so it was definitely right to let the little girl have a little more strength to protect herself. Fighting also required courage. If she did not even have the courage to face killing, then fighting would become a joke. Soren nodded gently and said in a deep voice, "We'll leave in a while, we'll go by sea. Asterisk 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 P.S. There are 2 more updates today but the time may be late. I just went to eat." Chapter 266. Under the Dark Night Sky. A warship with black sails entered the island's river from the estuary. Soren was quite patient. He waited until it was dark before he quietly approached the indigenous tribe's territory. This time he did not bring many people. Even with the Drow warriors, there were only 121 people. Most of the pirate minions were left in the camp. Because to achieve the effect of a surprise attack, there must be few people and they must be strong. Only an elite force could catch the enemy off guard. The night was getting darker. Soren and his men disembarked from the ship 10 kilometers away from the indigenous tribe. This distance was just right. If they were too close, it would be easy to alert the enemy. If they were too far away, it would be inconvenient to travel in the night. This time, most of the men Soren brought out were strange. They either had many scars on their faces and necks, holes in their ears, or strange tattoos all over their bodies. More than 70% of these guys were fierce-looking pirates. There was no doubt that they were also the elites among the pirates who had survived many battles. The pirate profession was the survival of the fittest. Basically, after 3 battles, the pirates who could survive would not be too weak. In this case, the pirates could improve their strength very quickly. After all, they were originally professionals. The pirates Soren brought out this time were all grade 2 and above. Among them, there were also 20% of the leaders around grade 3. These pirates were far better than ordinary pirates in terms of combat experience and equipment skills. The pirates' equipment was basically private. Soren did not have to pay for their equipment. They would use the bounty to buy equipment themselves. The worst of these pirates had exquisitely forged military weapons. Some of the leaders also had rare grade 1 weapons. Then the Drow warriors came down from the ship. They looked much better than when they first came. This was because Soren had replenished their equipment. Before he came, he had prepared a large number of standard military weapons, enough to equip nearly 300 people. This also included some leather armor and inlaid iron armor. As for better armor, it was difficult to get, mainly because the higher the price of armor, the higher the price. The price of a full-body armor would even make Soren's heart ache. Now, all the Drow warriors were wearing new leather armor, and nearly a third of their weapons had been replaced. After all, Soren had taken A+2 elven warbow from them, so he had to give them something in return. He was a very fair person. The overall strength of the people brought this time was very strong. Drows had quite strong night vision and basically had no problem fighting at night. After all, there was not much light in the Underdark. Most of these Drows were albino elves and half-elves, and they still had infrared vision in the dark. Then there were the pirates that were brought over. Basically, there was no possibility of night blindness, so during a night raid their combat power would not be reduced too much. Stop. Soren looked at the others behind him, then gave Vivian a look and said slowly, "We killed their scouts last time, so I'm afraid they'll be prepared. I'll go check if there are any hidden sentries." After that, he nodded to the others, and his whole body disappeared into the darkness. Soren's figure was completely covered by the night. After he entered stealth, he approached the indigenous tribe in front of him, and the people he brought over stayed nearly 3 kilometers away. Remove the hidden sentries. This was the most common job for rogues, and Soren was good at finding hidden sentries. There was a glimmer of light in front of him. Soren approached carefully along the edge of the road. He did not enter the tribe but very cautiously circled around. Soon he felt a slight movement coming from the bushes in the southwest. It was also very difficult to keep watch at night. The indigenous people could not stay still all night. Soren quietly crept over from the side, and then saw a skinny indigenous person crawling among them. The indigenous people of the outer islands were short, a bit like the indigenous people of Indonesia. They were often jokingly called indigenous monkeys by pirates. Soren lurked with no expression. When the distance was about 15 meters, he suddenly began to accelerate, but there was no sound. A faint cold light appeared, and Soren directly rushed over. He stretched out his hand to cover the other person's mouth and nose, and at the same time, his sword pierced through the back of the other person's heart and came out directly from the chest. A stream of blood came out, and the indigenous person that Soren blocked twitched, and then turned into a corpse. A row of cold data appeared. The battle is over. You launched backstab at the target. Caused 86 piercing damage. You hit the target's heart. Triggered fatal damage test. Target's fortitude test failed. Target died. You've gained 1750 slaughter EXP. Although Soren did not scan the strength of the indigenous people according to the slaughter EXP, he could still roughly judge the opponent's profession level, which should be around grade 3. Due to the lack of knowledge of civilization and not too many sorcerer bloodlines, there were very few spellcasters among the indigenous people. Most of the spellcasters were concentrated in the shamans. However, there were some people here who could control psionic abilities, and under normal circumstances, they would not appear in such a small tribe. It should be a large tribe with tens of thousands of people. The proportion of psionic abilities was probably much smaller than the proportion of sorcerers. Plop. A very slight sound. Soren put down the corpse in his hand, and then covered it a little bit with the grass. Then he went into stealth mode again and moved along the indigenous tribe. Since he had found the hidden sentry, there must be more than one. There must be other indigenous people nearby. Soren, who was in stealth mode, was very careful. After circling around and finding nothing, he began to expand the area and continue to search. Because if there was a hidden sentry that was not taken out and found them in advance, the effect of a sneak attack in the night would be greatly reduced, and they might even suffer heavy losses here. He was very patient. After circling around 3 times in a row, Soren finally found the second hidden sentry. It was actually hiding in a big tree near the south. If it was not for his sharp hearing, it would be really difficult to find it. Soren spent a whole hour to take out 3 hidden sentry outside the indigenous tribe. When he was sure that there were no more hidden sentry nearby, he went back to the place where he started. It was close to 1 o'clock in the morning. He entered the island river from the sea after it was completely dark. Along the way he cleaned up the hidden sentry. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning now. This was the best time for a sneak attack. Chapter 267. Soren returned to the beginning. At this time, the gap between the drow warriors and the elite pirates could be seen. In terms of strength, the difference between the two sides was not very big, but after more than an hour of waiting, the difference in discipline between the two sides was obvious. The drow warriors were still silent, but they would wipe their weapons from time to time. However, the elite pirates were a little restless. Many unruly pirates were a little impatient. If it were not for Soren's prestige and the suppression of the pirate leaders, they would have begun to stir. The discipline of the two sides was not at the same level at all. The former reminded Soren of the years in the Underdark. At that time he deeply experienced the cruel rule of the drow and the strict discipline of the drow army. However, the pirates were all elites, and they were a little impatient after waiting for more than an hour. They were completely used to being undisciplined. Soren saw the situation in front of him and immediately had the intention to train them well in the future. Let's go. With the appearance of Soren, the pirates immediately seemed to have found their backbone, and the restless elite pirates also settled down. When he gave the order to move forward, the others immediately began to approach the indigenous tribe. Vivian blessed herself with fly and invisibility, and flew directly to the front of the team. He did not know how the little girl's strength increased so much. Soren was very envious of her. She had been sleeping every day recently, but her flying and casting skills were so smooth. On the other hand, Soren could not master any other casting skills except for the ability to control spells. The drow warriors were still quite quiet and followed the team in silence. The pirates, on the other hand, made some noise from time to time, and complained in a low voice because of the bad road, but they were immediately reprimanded by the leaders. Darkblade shook his head. He did not have much hope for today's battle. In fact, he had already planned to retreat if the situation went wrong. After all, there were not many warriors in the tribe. The elite and precious drow warriors should not be wasted here. Now, he only hoped that they could succeed in their sneak attack, and that Sir Throat Cutter could also kill the spirits. The distance was getting closer and closer. With a glimmer of light in front of them, Vivian gradually lowered her altitude. The pirates were a little better. After all, they had seen the little girl fly and cast spells before, but the drows were a little scared. He felt that the little girl in front of him had unfathomable strength. She had already cast several spells in a row. Haste. The first spell was Haste, which was a group buff spell. It could increase the speed of people within a certain range. Vivian could buff about 20 people at a time, so she only used it 3 times in total to buff some of them. Dragon Strength. This was a spell that was meant for Soren, and it could greatly increase his combat prowess. The little girl didn't spend too many spell slots on buffs. After casting a few simple spells, She immediately began to cast a defensive spell on herself. Then she nodded at Soren. Their mission was to kill the shaman priest. They must not give the spellcaster a chance to attack. Otherwise their side would suffer great losses. Squeak. Soren easily opened the wooden fence of the indigenous tribe, and then a group of people quietly sneaked in. The guard on the watchtower had already been killed by Vivian's disintegrate, and the other was directly hit by Soren's enraged charm. Because of the buff spell, the drow warriors entered very quickly. During this period, the inferior indigenous people on the periphery were awakened, and before they could speak, their throats were cut. There was no mercy, no sympathy. In the blink of an eye, there were more than a dozen corpses here. Don't worry about the others. Soren looked around at his men and said in a deep voice, Dark Blade. You take people to attack the chief in the center of the tribe. I'll kill the shaman priest and then come back to meet you. He didn't know when the spirit would appear, so Soren could only kill the shaman priest first. His figure went directly into the shadows, and then walked toward the courtyard that he had confirmed at the beginning. Vivian's figure was flying in the air, and she had already cast greater invisibility on herself. The two quickly approached the position of the shaman priest. On the other side, Dark Blade had already led the drow warriors to launch a surprise attack and rushed directly to the center of the tribe. On the way, they inadvertently startled the indigenous people, but whether they were men or women, old or young, as long as they appeared in the line of sight, they were all killed. The drows would not pity these aborigines, and the pirates had no sympathy at all. Along the way, corpses and blood flowed. Those who wanted to resist were killed mercilessly, and soon there were nearly 100 more corpses. The drows were close to the center of the tribe, and the noise here awakened the indigenous warriors. However, many of them were killed on the spot by the drows who rushed in before they could pick up their weapons. It was already about 2 o'clock in the morning. Under normal circumstances, most people were sleeping soundly, and even if they heard the noise they would not react so quickly. Kill. Kill. The blood and screams finally alarmed the entire indigenous tribe, but it was a little late now. In just the first round of confrontation, the drows with night vision had completely gained the upper hand. Although they only had about 30 people, the number of heads harvested in the battle was twice that of nearly 100 pirates. They were indeed a race that could survive in the Underdark. When they killed, they would not be soft-hearted at all. Follow me. Dark Blade felt that there was a chance of victory and immediately said in a deep voice, Rangers, follow me. Shoot those guards. Attack the big house in front of you and kill the chief of the indigenous people. The elite pirates had begun to fight with the enemies who were gradually reacting. These guys were screaming when they fought. Although their momentum was quite amazing, it also alarmed more and more indigenous people. Casualties began to appear on their own side. 7 or 8 pirates died in a while, and more than a dozen were injured to varying degrees. More than half of them directly fainted. However, the casualties of the drows were very small. Only 3 of them were injured, and no one died because they had night vision and were more adapted to the current combat environment than the indigenous people. Blood flowed. The indigenous warriors were not gathered together. Although they lived in the center of the tribe, they lived in separate houses with their wives and children. Some of the half-grown children were also fighting, and they even killed 1 or 2 pirates. Dark Blade's expression was indifferent. He raised his hand and took out several throwing knives from his waist, and threw them at the indigenous children who looked at most 12 or 13 years old in front of him. The throwing knives hit the other party's chest, and the indigenous children fell directly to the ground. Then they heard the roar of an indigenous man nearby, followed by a scream. The drows did not have any change in expression, and the pirates were still murderous. On the other side, Soren and Vivian approached the shaman's courtyard. As soon as they arrived near the courtyard, the little girl could not help but frown and whisper, Brother, there's a strange atmosphere here. I don't like it very much. Soren was just about to say something. Suddenly, the house in front of them shook, and then a behemoth appeared in front of them. It was a huge brown bear about 5 meters long. Although it had the appearance of a brown bear, it did not have the aura of a living creature. After it appeared, it growled silently, and then rushed towards Soren, directly raising its huge bear paw. Clang, clang, clang. Soren naturally would not be hit by the enemy so easily. He dodged the attack and then swung his 2 swords at the huge brown bear in front of him. But to his surprise, the icing death in his right hand broke through the opponent's defense, but the curved sword in his left hand seemed to have hit some kind of tough energy field, and it was deflected to another place, causing almost no damage. Soren's expression was serious and he said in a deep voice, Spirit Bear, Chapter 268. Spirit Bear. It was a kind of animal spirit, mainly born from totem worship. Although its external manifestation was that of a bear, in fact, most of its spirits were composed of the souls of intelligent creatures. They belonged to the half-energy life form, somewhat similar to the form of a saint, but not as powerful as the saint form. The one in front of Soren was a spirit bear totem. The indigenous people liked to worship some fierce beasts, or it may be because their ancestors had interacted with some beasts, and then they believed in a certain kind of beast as a totem. The most common totems were wolves, bears, tigers, eagles, snakes, and so on. Soren didn't know much about totem worship, but he knew that there was a kind of indigenous tribe whose totem worship must not be provoked easily, and that was the tribe that worshipped insects as their totem worship. This kind of indigenous tribe was quite difficult to deal with. Perhaps there were not many of them and their strength did not seem to be too strong, but in fact, the danger was higher than many indigenous tribes with tens of thousands of people. Many legendary professions had fallen in their hands. Dang dang dang. The spirit bear in front of him was huge, and naturally gave Soren enough opportunities to attack, but the grade 1 rare curved sword in his hand seemed to be unable to do any damage to the spirit bear. Only the legendary curved sword could break the strange energy field of the enemy. The opponent was a half-energy life form, and almost had no fatal points, and was immune to any backstab attacks. The only thing that could work on them was heavy damage, but any heavy damage could not trigger the test of death. Vivian. Soren twisted and rolled to avoid the huge bear paw that had set off a gust of wind, and said in a deep voice, "You go and deal with the shaman first. I'll hold off this spirit bear." He didn't know how strong the spirit bear was. Its paw could set off a gust of wind, and it made Soren feel like he was dealing with a 1,000-year-old black bear in Eastern mythology. But even if the bear spirit in front of him seemed to be quite difficult to deal with, Soren was most afraid of the shaman who did not show up in the house. His long combat experience made him understand how much a spellcaster could change the situation in a battle, so the first thought in his mind was to let Vivian deal with the shaman. Even if the opponent's profession level might not reach level 15. Vivian had always obeyed Soren's words, so she didn't think too much about it. She raised her hand and threw a fireball at the door, causing half of the wall to collapse. Vivian continuously buffed herself with several defensive spells, and then cautiously flew in. The enemy seemed very cunning. From start to finish, the shaman priest didn't show himself. However, the little girl was not afraid at all because in the face of absolute strength, any strategy was useless. It was almost impossible for a legendary spellcaster to lose to a spellcaster below legendary. Bang! Soren dodged 5 consecutive attacks from the spirit bear and was finally forced into a position close to a dead end. He had no choice but to block the opponent's attack with his curved sword. Plop! Soren's figure flew out directly, and before he landed in midair, he had already spat out a mouthful of blood. His body hit the wall behind him, and directly knocked out a human-shaped dent in the earthen wall. Even with his extraordinary 21 points of constitution, at this moment, he felt that his internal organs had been turned upside down. The strength of the spirit bear was somewhat beyond Soren's estimation. It was probably more than 25 points. Just now, it had directly dealt crushing damage, causing him to enter a state of serious injury. Cough cough. Soren coughed after he landed, and a trace of blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth. The spirit bear in front of him did not hesitate at all. After it sent Soren flying with its paw, it rushed over and opened its bloody mouth to bite his head. Just the damage of a paw parry caused nearly 50 bruises on Soren's body, which was higher than the damage of being hit by other people. Soren estimated that the strength of the spirit bear could reach about 27 points, and it was very likely to be close to 30 points of strength, because the strength of each of its attacks was estimated to reach more than a ton. Evade sight. Shadow jump. Slaughter transformation. Soren's figure disappeared in an instant. His whole person escaped into the shadows, and then the huge body of the spirit bear rushed over. Because it suddenly lost its target, it could not stop the forward momentum and directly knocked down the house in front of it. At this time, Soren's figure also appeared in the distorted shadows. He only had a curved sword left in his hand. When the spirit bear's momentum could not be stopped, he suddenly stabbed the sword into the spirit bear's anus. Even if there was no fatal point, he did not believe that the whole sword would not be able to cause heavy damage to the spirit bear's anus. In fact, Soren did think too much. He stabbed the sword into the bear spirit's anus. With the increase of strength in the form of the slaughterer and the effect of Vivian's dragon strength, Soren almost stabbed the whole curved sword into the bear's anus. However, he did not feel like he had stabbed the intestines. Instead, he felt like he had stabbed into a tough muscle layer. This made Soren wonder if the spirit bear in front of him had internal organs. It looked like it only had the outline of a spirit bear's body, and there might not even be internal organs inside. Roar. Although he did not hit the heavy hit effect, Soren's attack unintentionally completely angered the spirit bear, and at the same time, it also caused a lot of damage to it. The position of the spirit bear's heavy hit was relatively special. It required the legendary ability, Expose Weakness, to accurately find it. Although Soren did not hit it, the damage was greater than other places. Pucci. Even in his slaughter form, Soren still did not dare to fight the spirit bear head-on. Because the strength of animals was far greater than that of humans, the normal slap of an ordinary brown bear would cause almost instant death to humans. An adult brown bear's front paw was enough to crush the back of a bison, and the power of the spirit bear in front of him was even more terrifying. It was estimated that in the entire outer islands, only a kind of gorilla jokingly called King Kong could compete with it in terms of strength. Knowledge, creature, variant of silverback King Kong. The sword was pulled out. Soren did not see any blood on the blade, as if there was no blood in the body of the spirit bear in front of him. With an angry roar, a huge bear paw swept across. Soren did not dare to take it head-on and could only dodge. At the same time, he stretched out his palm and slapped the back of the spirit bear. Vampiric Touch. The effect of the spell was still effective, and the opponent was not a demigod spirit. With the higher degree of conversion of the body's energy, in addition to being immune to any non-rare weapon attack, the spirit could also be immune to many level 1 to 3 low-grade spell attacks. This was due to the accumulation of spell resistance. If a legendary profession had high enough spell resistance, it could also offset many lower spell effects. Vampiric Touch directly stole the target's life energy, so the spirit bear almost took all the damage. At the same time, Soren's pale face showed a trace of blood. A very pure life energy poured into the body, and Soren's injuries recovered a lot. Shadow Strike. Not daring to fight the enemy head-on, Soren could only move around. Fortunately, creatures with too much strength were more clumsy and heavy when moving. The strength of the spirit bear was estimated to be higher than many giants, but its agility was only at the level of a normal person. As long as Soren paid attention not to be blocked by it, he could consume its strength little by little. According to the calculation of the damage received by blocking, the normal attack of the spirit bear could reach about 80 points, which was equivalent to the attack of a legendary sword saint. Soren could only withstand 3 attacks from it at most. Shadow Strike. The sound of magic explosion came from the house. Soren did not dare to be distracted to observe the situation over there, and could only take a look when he jumped into the air to avoid it. Vivian seemed to have encountered a little trouble, but his telepathy told Soren that the little girl was not injured, but there was some annoying trap inside. He could feel a trace of anger in the little girl's heart. Shadow Strike was a very useful combat skill. Its role was to use shadow energy to erode the target's body, which meant that it would be effective as long as there was contact. Soren's rogue was level 10, and Shadow Strike could cause an additional 10 points of shadow erosion damage as long as there was contact. Maybe this damage was nothing, but the accumulation of 10 chances per day was nearly 100 points of additional damage. Boom! There was a sudden explosion in the house, a bit like the explosion of a delayed fireball. Soren could not identify the level of the spell, but he could feel the elemental energy of the explosion. The explosion was like preparing a large amount of high explosives. The whole roof was lifted up, and then there was debris all over the sky as well as a nauseating smell that made one feel weak all over. When Soren transformed into a slaughterer, he actually felt a little affected by the smell. He did not know what this thing was refined from. Shadow Strike. Soren's curved sword once again slashed the back of the spirit bear. Just as he was ready to continue to pull away from it, the spirit bear in front of him suddenly roared. Spirit Bear Battle Roar, legendary skill. The sudden appearance of this roar shocked Soren. He had a feeling of seeing stars, and there was a trace of blood oozing out of his eardrums. It felt like he was suddenly hit by the legendary lion roar. This roar formed a substantial wave of air that vibrated and spread out like ripples, causing the nearby houses to tremble. Sound Wave Attack. One of Soren's most hated and feared attacks. Chapter 269. Sound Wave Attack. It was one of the most difficult attacks to defend against, and it was also the most troublesome attack for rogues. Whether it was the melee profession's Berserk Roar, War Roar, Fear Roar, or the spellcaster profession's roar, infrasonic wave, banshee's howl, etc., these attacks were all difficult to defend against with conventional means. Unless it was a spell that protected against sound wave attack, there was only one key to determining whether you could survive this attack, and that was whether your fortitude was enough to pass many tests. As for sound wave attacks, many were like various versions of lion roar, and there were few ways to defend against them. Even spellcasters would still stumble on this. As soon as the distance was shortened, it was almost impossible to pass the test of fortitude by relying on the weak constitution of the spellcaster without a spell in advance. In fact, at this moment, even Soren could not completely pass the test of fortitude. The sound waves of the roar made him dizzy, as if a cannonball had exploded directly beside him, and the shock wave made his eardrums bleed. Although he did not faint, Soren's current state was also very bad. He almost had no time to dodge the bear spirit's attack, and was directly slapped 7 or 8 meters away. Plop. Soren's figure landed on the ground, his chest was slightly sunken, and 7 or 8 of his ribs were broken. If it wasn't for the protective energy of stone skin on his body, it would have caused bruises of nearly 100 HP. Soren had just recovered a part of his HP with the help of vampiric touch, and his HP had decreased again, and his whole body had entered the state of serious injury. However, this attack also woke him up. He activated a legendary item almost without thinking, and at the same time his whole body rolled in an awkward posture to avoid the second attack. Summon Earth Elemental. Summon Shadow. A portal connecting to the elemental plane soon appeared, and then a heavy Earth Elemental appeared in front. Boom. The Earth Elemental hit the bear spirit with a fist, temporarily attracting its attention. At the same time, in a distorted shadow, a shadow that seemed to have a human shape appeared and directly launched an attack on the spirit bear spirit. Both of Soren's summoning spells were cast very quickly. One was the summoning ability of a legendary item, and the other was the supernatural ability of the Shadow Dancer. The attacks of the two summoned creatures obviously slowed down the pace of the spirit bear, and also bought precious time for Soren. He was finally free from the negative status effect caused by the sound wave attack. Even though he was heavily injured, Soren was still filled with fighting spirit. This was because the spirit bear in front of him had also been slashed more than 10 times. Coupled with the shadow erosion effect of Shadow Strike, it had also caused 100 to 200 points of damage to the enemy. In other words, the spirit bear's injuries would not be any better than Soren's. The intelligence of spirit creatures was not too high, and the fact that it used its ultimate skill meant that it had sensed danger. Soren didn't dare to fight it head-on, but it didn't mean that he had no other way. The curved sword in Soren's hand disappeared, and then a beautiful elven war bow appeared in his palm. He took out the quiver and put it behind him. Then he put an arrow on the bow and shot directly at the spirit bear's head. With Soren's dexterity, it would be impossible for the opponent to keep up with him if he tried his best to pull away, unless it could launch another roar attack. Stone to mud. Just when Soren shot the spirit bear, Vivian's petite figure also appeared in mid-air. She raised her little white hand and pointed in the direction of the spirit bear. Then the hard and solid ground turned into mud, and the huge body of the spirit bear sank directly. It took a long time for it to climb out of it. This level 5 spell had many uses, and how to use it depended on the person. Soren had asked the wizard to help him set up a huge trap with this spell. Swoosh swoosh swoosh. Soren shot 5 or 6 arrows in a row, and then pulled out his curved sword. There were no special arrows in his hand. Ordinary steel arrows could not cause much damage to the spirit bear. If he wanted to fly a kite, he had to be able to break through the spirit bear's defense. At the very least, he had to have 20 explosive arrows, frost arrows, poisoned arrows, and so on. Only then could it be possible to kite some powerful enemies. Ordinary arrows completely relied on the +2 armor penetration attribute of the elven war bow to cause 2 or 3 points of damage. It was quite difficult to kill the spirit bear, and it could only be used to reduce the opponent's HP. Missile Storm. Acid Arrow *2. Flame Arrow *3. After Vivian temporarily trapped the spirit bear with stone to mud, she began to cast continuously. It seemed that the little girl's combat experience was much richer than before. She actually judged in advance that as a divine creature, the spirit bear in front of her was difficult to control with ordinary spells. From its appearance, it could be judged that it had a very strong immunity ability. So the spell Vivian chose was not a control spell, but the stone to mud could have a control effect. Many wizard spells did not have to be controlled to be used to restrict the enemy's activities. A barrage of spells fell from the sky. Some of it was offset by the spirit bear's magic resistance, but the other part still seriously injured its body, especially the attack of the acid arrow and flame arrow, which caused quite a lot of damage to it. Soren's figure also rushed up at this time. The shadow bit and attacked around the spirit bear. It was a shadow creature and almost didn't have much weight. Although the earth elemental was about to fall apart, it still had 30% of its combat power. Die. Soren held his sword with both hands and slashed on the head of the spirit bear. It had already been in a state of near-death by Vivian's spell bombardment, and finally ended under a round of siege. It was directly cut off by Soren. A bear's head fell to the ground. But there was no blood gushing out. The body of the spirit bear in front of Soren's eyes quickly dissipated, like fireworks, turning into a slightly shining light in the sky. This was the power of the elements. A fairly pure elemental energy, it was a body in a semi-energy state. The flying energy dissipated. Some of it condensed and became a crystal-like substance. This was a crystal stone after the elemental energy was highly condensed. It was a very rare tool. Other than legendary creatures that would leave it behind, only a part of it could be found in the elemental plane. This was an important material that many spellcasters needed. A row of data appeared. Launched beheading attack. Beheading successful. You've dealt 49/ damage to the target. Target dead. You've gained 7500 slaughter EXP. Target is a divine creature. Automatically extracting divine energy from the target's body. You've gained 2 divinity points. A power full of divinity emerged and gradually integrated into Soren's body. He originally had 9 divinity points, and now he had accumulated 11 divinity points. He didn't know if it was because the spirit bear itself didn't have much wisdom, but Soren didn't feel a strong will in this divine energy. Instead, it was like some kind of chaotic and hazy subconsciousness. It was as if many people's prayers had gathered together and finally formed a consciousness with simple thoughts. This consciousness was quite weak. Because it didn't have much self-concept, it could be ignored compared to the will of the Dread Lord. Soren swallowed it without hesitation. Then, a divine light appeared in his eyes, followed by a series of data prompts. Fused divinity points. Divinity fusion successful. You fused 2 divinity points. Current total divinity points is 11. You've automatically mastered the minor divinity talent. Minor divinity, innate ability. You have a very weak divinity in your body. Although this divinity is nothing to many powerful existences, it has allowed you to gradually step into the realm of transcendence and sainthood. Due to your own ability, the transformation of the divinity you possess is biased towards the lower planes, so the effect of the minor divinity you possess is similar to other high-grade demons who are born with divine power. This divine power will gradually strengthen as your divinity points increase. All attributes +1. Chapter 270. All attributes +1. When Soren had the minor divinity, he looked completely different. Although his appearance was still the same as before, the aura he exuded was somewhat similar to that of a deity. If one had to describe it in Eastern terms, then there was a trace of unity of heaven and man, but this aura was obviously the unity of heaven and man, of the devil path. Soren's originally delicate face now had a trace of evil charm. It was difficult to describe in words, but it was a real change. This kind of change in aura could easily attract mortals to him. The strength of the Abyss demons largely came from the divine power they were born with. Basically, the high-grade demons in the Abyss had a trace of divinity. The power of divinity could be gradually accumulated, so the struggle between high-grade demons was also very cruel. Many existences even robbed others of their divinity to strengthen their own strength. The almost endless demon army was the best target to rob divinity, but unfortunately, there were very few people who could succeed in the end. There must be an ancient history mentioned here. That was the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus. He was one of the oldest existences in the whole world. It was said that when he was first born, it was because of the appearance of the source of chaos. There were very few clear records about that history. It was only known that demons appeared in the source of chaos, which was the first demon army. This was the oldest demon army. Many of them were burning with raging flames. It was the ancestor army of the current 3rd generation of Tana-Re demons, a terrible creature born from the source of chaos. The demons crossed the universe uninvited and seriously threatened the oldest group of gods at that time, which was the ancient gods of order that had only a few records. This battle lasted for quite a long time. The ancient gods of order were tired of the endless war, so they began to create a creature to help them fight against the demon army. These creatures were angels. Of course, Soren preferred to call them Otherworld God's servant. Among these warriors with beautiful wings, Asmodeus was the most brave and the most beautiful one. He killed more demons than any other angel, and even more than any other god. But countless years had passed, and Asmodeus and other battle angels had gradually been infected with some of their enemies' characteristics. Gradually, their originally beautiful appearance became ugly, and the ancient gods of order and other angels began to fear them. They were devouring the divinity of the primitive demons. Even if this process was passive, they still changed day by day and became stronger day by day. Asmodeus' power became more and more amazing. Although he was still a servant of the ancient gods of order, he had begun to use the law to gain power for himself. The privileges and rewards he asked for from the ancient gods of order were gradually more powerful than many gods. The divinity of the demons was further eroding their bodies, and Asmodeus and his oldest subordinates were all transforming. Finally, demons were born. Asmodeus became the Lord of Hell, the ruler of the devils. He was the only one who could fight against a powerful god just by relying on his divinity and not his divine domain. There was also one of the few existences that could be great divinity. By the way, the devils had inherited part of the divinity of the primitive demons, so many of them were completely immune to fire damage, and many of the existing demons were not immune to fire damage. There were many legends about Asmodeus. But this was the one that Soren thought was most likely, because there were records in some ancient ruins that recorded the scene of Asmodeus fighting against the source of chaos. That was an era that was much older than the bloody war in the abyss. Almost none of the existing gods had lived from that era. Even many of the so-called ancient gods might not have been born in that era. Including the material plane that Soren was in, there were no gods in that era. It was even more impossible for gods to be born in this material plane. Soren had entered the realm of demons. Although he did not realize it himself, after obtaining minor divinity, he was indeed close to becoming a demon. The only difference was that there was a trace of a demon's aura on him. Demons were crazy existences, but demons were quite calm. If Soren's current strength was close to the demons, then his inner strength was close to the demons. As the main force of the bloody war in the abyss, demons were almost irreconcilable enemies. But one thing that was undeniable was that whether it was the current third generation of Tana, demons or the demons that had survived until today, part of their power source came from the most ancient primitive demons, which was the evil power born in the source of chaos. Demons were still demons. Devils had only inherited the evil while maintaining the order of things. Knowledge, myth. The body of the spirit bear dissipated. An amber-colored gem-like crystal was left on the ground. Soren's eyes showed a trace of divinity. A row of data appeared in front of him. Acquired, minor divinity. The bloodline of the Son of Slaughter has acquired divine power. Awakened potential demonic abilities. Automatically mastered, minor fire resistance. Automatically mastered, minor poison resistance. Automatically mastered, minor electric resistance. Acquired supernatural ability, telepathy 10 feet. A large number of data displays appeared in front of Soren's eyes. Maybe it was because the divine power had broken through the critical point, dense zeros and ones began to appear in front of his eyes, and then gradually calmed down. Then he gained 3 more basic resistance specialties and a supernatural ability. Minor fire resistance, personal ability. Minor divinity gives you a part of resistance to fire damage. From now on, you are immune to any cold damage below 1 point. When attacked by spells or spell-like attacks, any damage with cold effects will be reduced by 1 point. With the strengthening of divine power, you will gradually increase your resistance to fire, and eventually may be completely immune to fire damage. Prerequisite, minor divinity. The 3 minor resistance abilities were the same. Unlike the cold resistance that Soren had acquired before, this resistance was not trained by him, but it was an effect of minor divinity, so it could only be strengthened by the improvement of divine power. Demons had naturally resistant skin. In the end, it was possible to be immune to any fire, poison, and electric damage, but most demons had lost their most ancient bloodline. Only the Baler, which was considered to have the purest bloodline, could be completely immune to fire, poison, and electric damage. So far, there were not many things that could be verified. The only thing that Soren knew was that almost all primitive demons were immune to fire damage, and the Baler was one of the more orthodox demon descendants that survived. The last one was a supernatural ability that was added by divine power. Telepathy 10 feet, supernatural ability. Divine power gives you a supernatural telepathy ability, and the range of this ability will gradually increase with divine power. Telepathy can be used in many situations. It can strengthen your abilities in all aspects, and at the same time, it can be stacked with special perception type abilities such as Sixth Sense, Evasion Intuition, Super Sixth Sense, and so on. This ability will gradually increase with the level of divinity. This was a very good supernatural ability. In a way, it made up for Soren's weakness of not having Evasion Intuition, but the range of its effect was still too small. According to the information in Soren's memory, the Baylor was born with telepathy 100 feet. Speaking of which, he really couldn't understand how Chui Heighten killed the Baylor with a challenge rating of 20 with just one slash. One had to know that his profession level was not as high as the Baylor's challenge rating at that time. Under normal circumstances, even if he just stood there and let him kill it, it would take him a long time to kill it. Didn't you see how long Gandalf the Berserker Wizard fought to kill the Baylor? After that, he directly leveled up to Gandalf the White-Robed Berserker Wizard. The power of divinity fused with the body. Soren's pupils were slightly red. This was not the influence of divinity, but the bloodthirst of the slaughterer form. Just killing the spirit bear was not enough to satisfy his bloodthirst after transforming into the slaughterer form. Soren had to kill more enemies to prevent himself from entering the slaughterer state. Vivian's petite figure landed on the ground. She seemed to be a little worried as she looked at Soren, who was in front of her with a strong murderous aura. At this time, Soren saw the true face of the shaman priest. It was actually an extremely thin natural dwarf. He was probably not young. No wonder he was so cunning and refused to come out. But in the end he still died in the hands of Vivian. Because the difference in strength between the two was too obvious, there were very few legendary professions in the indigenous tribe. Most of them were similar to the earthbound spirit that only appeared in the tribe. "Let's go." Soren looked around and said in a deep voice, "Let's go and help them." Although the spirit and the shaman priest were killed, the battle was not over. There was still a lot of fighting power in the indigenous tribe. Soren had to suppress them as soon as possible and let these indigenous people surrender. Otherwise, when the battle was over, more than half of his pirates would be killed or injured. Just now, the proportion of his men who were injured had reached nearly 1/3. This group of idiots. Even the inferior aborigines had begun to resist, but they did not notice that they were about to be surrounded by thousands of ordinary people like dumplings in a moment. Discipline -3. Chapter 271. The sky was just beginning to brighten. The indigenous tribe was filled with cries and shouts. Many houses had been swept away and the ground was a mess. There were also many bloodstains and corpses that had not dried yet. The strong smell of blood attracted many dangerous beasts, but after seeing the village in front of them, they were smart enough not to approach. Piles of hides, belongings, and swords were collected and piled up in front of the chief's house in the center. There were also a lot of gold and silver weapons. The indigenous people liked to use gold and silver to show their status. The empty space in the center was filled with a dense mass of human heads. All the weapons were confiscated, and the captured indigenous people were all separated into women, children, and adult men. Then they were all tied together with ropes. There were not many old people among the indigenous people because their average life expectancy was less than 40 years old, so most of the indigenous people were adults. Children who were over 14 years old were also considered adults. They had not forgotten the battle last night. The bloodstains on the ground made these indigenous people full of fear. Especially the way they looked at Soren, it was as if they were looking at a very terrible existence. The battle ended soon after the soul essence was killed. There was basically no accident. Ordinary indigenous warriors could not block Soren's attack at all. Although he had just reached the realm of a high-grade profession, he was not without the slightest confidence in fighting against a legendary creature. The number of captives had not been counted, but there should be 800 or 900 people. After all, the people who escaped last night were only a few. The drows quickly controlled the situation. After all, the drows were also a race that relied on slaves. Sure enough. Soren looked at the busy men in front of him and said to himself, the drows' ability to do things is indeed much better than the pirates. Whether it was the discipline during battle or the process of capturing slaves. The drow warriors were completely superior to the elite pirates under Soren's command. The drow society was supported by slaves, so they were also good at controlling slaves under the influence of what they saw and heard. However, the best at enslaving other races in the world were the soul suckers. That kind of creature was born to control other races. The drows were still good at the dark arts, but for Soren, their abilities were indeed much better than the pirates. Sir. A one-eyed pirate approached Soren and bowed respectfully. "I've finished counting." Soren looked at him and asked, "How are the casualties?" One-eyed dragon turned his head and looked behind him. He looked a little guilty and said in a low voice, 26 died, 42 were injured, and the rest were basically just minor injuries. I've already given those who couldn't be saved a quick death. The casualties were so high. Soren's face did not look good. He turned around and glanced at the drows. Dark Blade was collecting the bodies of his companions. A total of 3 drows were killed and most of the others were injured. The difference between the two was too great. This was the difference between disciplined and undisciplined in battle. Nearly 30 elite pirates had died. If it were other pirates, their morale might have collapsed. Looking back at the drows, only 3 of them had died and only a dozen of them were injured. It seemed that in a large-scale battle, the strength of the pirates was indeed not that great. Send a signal for people to come over. Soren looked at one-eyed dragon in front of him and ordered in a deep voice, "Use ships to transport these slaves back. First, transport the children and women back, then the adults. Let the people in the camp come over and help. If there are any strange movements, kill without mercy." The indigenous tribes did not have much wealth. All the spoils added up to 10 or 20,000 Kindler coins worth, and this was including the fur goods they had accumulated. These things had to be transported to the south coast to be exchanged for money. Here they were just ordinary daily necessities. Most of the captured indigenous people were ordinary people, but there were also a small number of professions. These people were strictly guarded, and there were only about 50 or 60 of them. As for the original chiefs and high-ranking nobles, they had long been slaughtered by Soren. These high-ranking indigenous people must not be left alive. They must all be killed to control them. The pirates began to get busy. One by one, the ferocious pirates kicked and drove the indigenous slaves away. Many of their brothers had just died last night, so they were naturally not in a good mood now. Soren did not have much pity in his heart. He just warned them that they must not break the slaves because these were important assets that he needed. Long ropes tied the wrists of the indigenous slaves, and then pulled them forward one by one like animals. The warship had been docked in the river in front, and these slaves would soon be transported back to the camp. Set fire. Soren looked at the ruined village in front of him and said in a deep voice, "Burn it all." A big fire ignited. Many of the aborigines wailed and cried. Their former home had turned into a sea of fire. Now they didn't even have a place to stay. Seeing that the tribe was completely turned into ashes in the fire, many indigenous people were angry, but more of their expressions gradually became numb, as if they had lost hope and let the pirates take them to the warship. They were homeless and their tribe had been wiped out. They were now slaves and goods. Without a place to stay, they had no hope and no more choice. They did not even have the courage to resist. Thick smoke rose. Soren looked at the village that turned into a sea of fire in front of him, and then turned to look at the slaves tied up with ropes. He could not help but show a smile on his face. He finally had a foothold in the outer islands. After getting rid of the indigenous tribe in front of him, this island was his territory. Unless he took the initiative to provoke other indigenous tribes, the chances of them attacking Soren would be greatly reduced. At this time he finally had time to slowly develop, and these nearly 1,000 slaves also provided him with a lot of labor. The progress of the construction of the camp would be greatly accelerated. It's a pity for these cultivated lands. Soren stood on a higher slope and looked at the cultivated lands near the tribe. He could not help but feel pity. These cultivated lands are ripe after many years of cultivation, and there are specially dug ditches. Although the area is not very large, it is quite valuable. It's a pity that the place to develop is not here, and the river here is not very convenient to connect to the sea, so I can only give up all these cultivated lands. The cultivated lands could be developed again. However, the location of the natural port was difficult to change by manpower. Soren could not change his plan for a little land. His strength could not be dispersed because the outer islands were very dangerous. Chapter 272. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. The first batch of indigenous slaves was transported back to the camp. The other pirates who did not participate in the battle all watched with curiosity and excitement, watching them drag groups of slaves from the ship. These indigenous slaves were relatively short, with dark skin and rickety bones. No one knew if they were born like this or if it was caused by living habits. The pirates kicked and kicked the indigenous slaves down, and then all of them were locked in cages in the camp. These slaves could not start working right away. Qualified slaves must be professionally domesticated. The slaves that were originally transported by Soren were still busy working. After seeing these captured slaves, they could not help but show curiosity and gloat, but there was not much pity and sympathy. Because there were not so many people in the world who were overflowing with sympathy, otherwise the paladin would not have become a spiritual symbol. Strictly speaking, this was an era of moral decay. Whether it was the noble class or the rich class, their lives were relatively luxurious and debauched. Even the poor of the lower class were not necessarily kind-hearted. Because of the hardships of life, many of them were full of resentment and extreme hatred. It was just that there was no chance for evil yet. Otherwise, no one would use the paladin as a tool. This situation would continue until the devils appeared. Their provocative words would arouse hatred in the hearts of these lower-class poor people, and eventually turn into widespread riots and rebellions. This was the precursor to the beginning of the Age of Turmoil. When rebellions and riots occurred, the arrival of the Avatar crisis was already very close. Vivian's figure appeared on the deck. The little girl seemed to be indifferent to everything in front of her. Although she was a very kind little girl and was very sympathetic to others as long as things involved Soren, then her moral concept would become, her brother is always right. So she just looked at it calmly, then turned and entered her room. In her mind, another guy was about to bare his fangs and brandish his claws, making the little girl want to pull him out and give him a good spanking, just like how Soren would occasionally spank her a few times when she made a mistake. Lillian. The little girl raised her slender eyebrows, raised her little white hand and knocked her forehead and said to herself, "What are you doing? Hurry up and calm down." He knocked himself on the head. At this moment the little girl looked a little silly but also cute. Looking at her, one could not help but want to laugh. "Do you feel it? Do you feel it?" Lillian's voice sounded very excited, as if she had discovered an earth-shattering secret. She waved her claws in Vivian's mind and said, "Didn't you feel it? You actually didn't feel it? You really are an idiot. Ah." Sure enough, Big Brother is the closest to me. Am I the only one who felt it? There was a hint of anger on Vivian's adorable little face, and she harumphed as if she were a little unhappy. "Lillian, are you crazy? If you have something to say, say it quickly. If you do this again, I'll lock you up. You should know that I'm in control of this body now." Lillian finally behaved herself. There was no other way. Although she was a little stronger between the two of them, Vivian was the one in control after all. Her control of the body was innately higher than hers, especially after Vivian also began to master divine power. Lillian seemed to be a little angry, but she did not dare to refute blatantly. She was like a naughty child who was completely suppressed by her parents. She held her breath and said, "You really are an idiot. You didn't even realize that Big Brother had merged with the divinity of the spirit bear. Big Brother also looks like a deity?" She finally noticed something. In the past, although Soren also killed the Son of Fear, he only absorbed the divinity, and the divine power was transferred to Vivian. Therefore the two little girls did not notice the difference in Soren. They just thought that the power of the killed Son of Fear had been transferred to them, but it was not completely transferred. However, everything that happened when dealing with the spirit bear made Lillian notice a slight difference. There was no transfer of divine power, and the divinity was directly merged with Soren. Son of Fear? Vivian was startled when she heard the words, then she frowned and murmured, "Is Big Brother also a Son of Fear? But why didn't he become like us? Big Brother doesn't seem to have divine power?" The room was silent. Vivian and Lillian seemed to have thought of something else, and they were all lost in thought. Soren could absorb divinity. But was he a Son of Fear? This time even Lillian was not so sure. On the other side, the tribe of the indigenous people had been turned into ashes. Soren led his men to watch over the indigenous captives, and at the same time he ordered the leader of the Drow warriors. Dark Blade Andri's expression was a little hesitant. It seemed that he was not willing to accept Soren's request, but he could not refuse it. In the end he could only helplessly say, "Your Excellency, we have sworn to give up our faith in the Spider Queen Lolth, so we have abandoned many cruel skills. I'm afraid your request will make us feel very embarrassed." "Is that so?" Soren had a playful expression on his face and he said slowly, "The Dark Maiden has fallen for so long. Is the faith of your tribe still maintained? Without the divine skills bestowed by the gods, your decline is almost inevitable. Are you still pedantically pursuing the so-called kindness? You have been wandering in the surface world for so long, haven't you seen through the nature of this world? Kindness requires strength to maintain. Without strength, kindness will become weakness that can be bullied. You are already so weak, do you still want to abandon the important skills inherited from the drows? They may be evil and cruel, but at least they can maintain your tribe, right? Look at these indigenous people. If we don't find a way to strengthen ourselves, it will be difficult for us to survive here for a long time. Soren's words were like the devil's temptation, and Dark Blade showed a struggling expression on his face. The Sir in front of him was tempting them to fall again and find some evil traditions that had been abandoned. Those bloody, cruel, and ruthless methods were the key to the Drow's reputation in the Underdark. When they were pursuing kindness and the surface world, they had given up many cruel methods. These included extremely cruel punishments, as well as various methods of control and slavery. Soren raised his hand and pointed to the indigenous slaves in front of him, and said in an impassioned voice, "There are nearly 1,000 people here. They can work for us, provide us with food, build cities for us, and in the future, cultivate some of them for handicrafts. What we need, these people can bring us. Do you still expect the warriors in your tribe to work for us? I have been to the Underdark. I know very well how evil and cruel the traditions of the Drows are. I also hate the ruthless killing. But those are forcibly distorted wills to please the Spider Queen. We can abandon the traditions that appeared to please the Spider Queen and find the oldest dark skills of the Drows again. So that we can have a foothold here. Maybe you should ask the female priest in your tribe to come and talk to me. I think they will agree with my point of view. The Drows were really strong. If you knew anything about this race, you would find that every family of the Drows was in a cruel internal struggle, and from time to time children and brothers would kill each other. Then you would open your eyes and look, and you would find that every family of the Drows was fighting among themselves. The families in each city were still fighting among themselves, and the cities were still fighting among themselves. In such endless internal fighting and killing, the Drows could still dominate the entire Underdark and become the most powerful force. From time to time they could also send elite troops to counterattack and harass the surface elves. One could only imagine how powerful they were. Anyone who understood the traditions of the Drows could clearly feel that they were a race that courted death. The cruel rule of the Queen of Spiders was also quite courting death, but it was this constant courting of death that made both the Queen of Spiders and the Drows grow stronger step by step. When Soren walked in the Underdark with others, there was only one intuitive view in his mind. That was, if the Drow family and the Drow city united, they could form a huge army that was so powerful that it was terrifying in an instant. In the Underdark, the attack on the surface elves was carried out by a Drow city. In other words, the Drows were city by city and very few Drows were united. No one knew what the Queen of Spiders was thinking. Anyway, she had always encouraged the cruel struggle among the Drows. Perhaps she thought that this would make her feel happy. Punishment, slavery, assassination. The dark skills of the Drows were useful skills that Soren valued. They were crueler than pirates and more professional than slave traders. Especially the female priests among the Drows, they were experts in this category. Soren needed these evil means. Otherwise, it would take a long time for him to control these indigenous slaves. In the entire Underdark, the Drows' means of controlling slaves were second only to the Soul Eaters. They were more skillful than the Beholders, who were completely controlled by spells. Every Drow city had a large number of slaves, and their dark skills were accumulated over a long period of time. Of course, their evil also manifested in obscenity, chaos, depravity, taboos, and so on. What Dark Blade was worried about was that once the door of evil was opened, his people would return to their original lives, unless there was a strong external force to force them out of the abyss of complete depravity. Otherwise, the tradition of assassination within the Drows would gradually recover. It was difficult for people to become good, but it was a matter of a moment to become bad. Chapter 273. A day passed quickly. In order to transport these indigenous slaves back, Soren mobilized 3 large ships. Because they were worried that these indigenous captives would resist, they could only transport them in batches, escorting about 100 people at a time. After running back and forth several times, the final count of captives was 1,056 people. These captives were very useful. As long as they could be controlled, Soren's construction progress would be greatly accelerated, and it would save him the trouble of transporting captives from Port Tylon. Batches of people were transported back. By the time Soren was done, it was already dark. There were suddenly more than 1,000 people in the camp, and both space and food became tight. Fortunately, there were still a lot of rations in the indigenous tribe. Soren should have no problem supporting them for about 2 or 3 months. Because the number of indigenous captives was too large, Soren had to order his men to guard them strictly. All the captives were divided into 3 parts, and 50 or 60 people were left in each place to take turns to keep watch. Even the drow warriors were arranged to be in charge of guarding the captive indigenous warriors. These were very troublesome. It would be best if they could be subdued, but if they couldn't, Soren was ready to kill them all. At least he could get tens of thousands of slaughter EXP. Manpower was really important in a relatively barren era. Logically speaking, Soren's strict arrangement should not have any problems. Because he hardly slept that night, he just closed his eyes and took a nap for about 3 hours. There were only more than 300 pirates in the camp, and only 30 drow warriors, but the number of slaves and captives reached more than 1,300. In this case, it was difficult for Soren to rest in peace. He was even prepared to use cruel means to suppress the resistance of the captives. However, the real problem wasn't the captive natives, nor the slaves that were brought over. It was Soren's own men. His men were missing. There was more than one missing person. 3 people suddenly disappeared in the middle of the night. The pirate in charge of guarding the fence tower patted his chest and promised that no one went in or out at night, and no one approached the fence. But even so, 3 of Sauron's men were still missing. They disappeared completely inexplicably, leaving no trace behind. The pirate minion in charge of their shift stated that the 3 of them had completely disappeared from the campsite in the time it took to brew a cup of tea. How is this possible? Soren was sitting in the hall in the wee hours of the morning. He frowned as he listened to the one-eyed man's report. He murmured, "How could 3 living people just disappear all of a sudden?" These were all pirates who had experienced many battles. At the very least, they were Tier 2 pirates. His disappearance was so strange. This was probably not something that could be done through conventional means. "Keep looking." Soren looked at his subordinates in front of him and said in a deep voice, "Search the entire camp. I don't believe that 3 living people would disappear for no reason." The one-eyed pirate below nodded in response, and then the pirates set up their torches. Groups of pirates began to walk around the campsite. This sudden movement also caused some commotion among the captives, but no one acted rashly. The slaves of the inferior natives were still relatively high. One by one, the pirate minions scattered around the campsite. Some people even searched outside the fence, but there was still no trace of them. Half an hour quickly passed. Many people had returned to their original positions, but they couldn't find any trace of them. There were also no footprints leading outside. As for the footprints in the campsite, it was too messy to trace them. Time passed little by little. Soren naturally had to let his men rest when he couldn't find them. But he felt like something was pressing down on his heart, and he kept feeling that something was wrong. Soren naturally couldn't sleep in this situation. So he sat in the hall until a glimmer of light appeared on the horizon. But at this time, Soren suddenly heard a commotion outside and then some people's screams and screams. He, who had been sitting on the chair, opened his eyes almost instantly. Then he saw Soren's figure turned into a shadow and rushed to the place where the commotion occurred at an amazing speed. In front of him he saw a group of patrolling pirates. These pirates were hugging a person. In front of them, there were minions shouting and waving their swords, as if they were trying to stop something from getting close. The smell of blood. Soren frowned and leaped. His toes touched the wall of the house, and then his whole body flew through the air like an eagle, and then landed in front of the group of pirate minions. What Soren saw in front of him made his whole body tremble. Then a cold light appeared in his palm, and without hesitation, he slashed at the vague shadow in front of him. Shadow distortion. The space in front of Soren was like a distorted picture. Under the shadow of the house, there was a gray crack that looked like a crack. Inside it, there were 3 to 5 distorted shadows and 2 badly mutilated corpses. From the characteristics, scars, and clothes of these corpses, it was almost certain that they were Soren's pirates. The shadow crack. The space channel that connected to the shadow plane appeared for some reason. It had supernatural spatial power, and it was possible to directly suck people who were close to it into the shadow plane. Most of these shadow cracks appeared in places that were strongly connected to the material plane, and there were supernatural forces that maintained the operation of the cracks. Most of the time they would appear at a certain time, and then when the operation of the energy deviated, these shadow cracks would gradually disappear. Retreat. Soren yelled at his subordinates beside him. Then he leaped and passed through the shadow rift. Sword form, spinning strike. The scimitar in his hand drew a cold light and avoided the distorted shadows nearby. Then he kicked the corpses of the two pirate subordinates into the air and returned to the material plane from the shadow plane. Bang! The two corpses fell to the ground. The space of the shadow crack seemed to be gradually closing because the sky had begun to brighten. A string of data appeared in Soren's eyes, but he had no energy to look at it at this time. At this moment, the things that appeared in front of him had already shocked him greatly. He couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. Then he came back to his senses, stomped his foot, and rushed back to the material plane through the gradually closing crack of the shadow plane. At the moment when he returned to the material plane, Soren looked deeply in front of him. It was a tall tower that pierced the sky. A wizard tower that was almost intact, with gray stone walls, no more than 3 kilometers away. The location and direction were similar to the place where Soren found the mutated plant in his memory. The only difference was, the one in the material plane was a ruin, but the one in the shadow plane was a complete wizard tower. Chapter 274. Space Closure. When Soren's figure came out of the shadow fissure, the sun just happened to rise from the horizon. Then, there was some kind of unpredictable energy change, and the shadow fissure that appeared quickly disappeared under the shadow of the corner of the house. There was a bloodstain on Soren's back, which was left behind by the twisted shadow. This kind of half-energy, half-material shadow creature was very difficult to deal with. Although it was only a third-grade monster, it could threaten the lives of high-grade professions. They had a natural ability to dodge attacks and half-energy attacks. The injury on Soren's back was nothing, and his powerful regeneration ability had already begun to heal. He calmly put away his curved sword, and then bent down to look at the two corpses on the ground. There were not many wounds on the corpses, and they did not die in the hands of the twisted shadow. Evil spirit? Or curse? Or something else? Soren's understanding of the shadow plane was second only to the Underdark, so after looking at the corpses, he knew that the pirates in front of him did not die in the hands of the twisted shadow. After they entered the shadow plane, they explored it for a while and then found the exit, but they encountered the twisted shadow. How is it? Soren looked at the others around him and said in a deep voice, "Can the other one be saved?" Of the 3 pirates that disappeared, 2 of them were dead, and the last one was covered in blood and had fainted. No one knew what happened to them when they fell to the ground. At this moment, the pirate who knew medicine had already rushed over. He stretched out his hand to check the breath of the unconscious pirate, and even opened the pirate's eyes to check other characteristics. With a serious face he said, "Your Excellency. He seems to have been cursed. I'm not sure. Whether he can survive or not depends on his luck." There were some pirates who knew a little about magic. After hearing his words, Soren's face did not look very good. He turned to look at the others and said in a deep voice, "Seal this place. No one is allowed to come near this area." The shadow plane was connected to his camp. It seemed that there was some incredible power in the shadow plane. This secret was most likely related to the ancient arcane empire. The tower Soren saw was even taller than Gloria's wizard tower. It was so tall that it looked like it was piercing through the clouds. This kind of construction was quite difficult, and it was built in the style of the arcane empire. This was because the legendary great arcanists were quite arrogant. They built such tall adept towers with the intention of standing shoulder to shoulder with the gods. Most of the ancient wizard towers in the material plane had been turned into ruins. Soren didn't expect that there would still be a wizard tower from the arcane empire in the shadow plane. This thing was very dangerous. Because if it was controlled by someone, then it would be a terrifying strategic weapon, basically not too far from an atomic bomb. But if it was not controlled by someone, then it was also quite dangerous. This meant that it had a terrifying defense program, so no one had controlled it until today. Soren was not naive enough to think that this wizard tower had been waiting for his arrival. There were also native creatures in the shadow plane. Although many of them were not very intelligent, it was easy for them to find this wizard tower, not to mention travelers from the material plane. For thousands of years. Someone must have found it, but he didn't know who had successfully entered it. In front of a resplendent and magnificent building, Adele Isabella stood in front of the door with a box in her hand. In front of her was a heavy steel golem. This was one of the territories of the Alchemist Guild. The great arcanists were still as arrogant as ever. It was quite difficult to meet them. Even the red-haired female pirate, who was a grade 4 profession, took 3 days to meet the person appointed by Soren. In the end, the other party was still busy with experiments and did not have time to meet an irrelevant woman. The glory of the wizards could still last for a while. At this stage, the great arcanists all over the world were still high and mighty. The Wizard Alliance's sphere of influence covered the whole continent, and they maintained contact with each other in a loose structure. Adele Isabella's face was not very good, because if someone wanted to see someone and waited for 3 days without seeing them, they would be in a very bad mood. She looked at the steel golem in front of her and said helplessly, "Well then. If Sir Lucian is really busy, then please help me pass this box to him. I believe he will be interested in the things inside. There is also a letter my master gave him." The steel golem looked at her, then nodded and put away the things. Don't underestimate these alchemy puppets. The great arcanists had already extended their magic to the range of souls. These alchemy life forms were all creatures with souls, but they were not complete souls, but some broken soul fragments. They had simple wisdom. Although most of them could not think directly, they were equivalent to smart computers. As for the more advanced alchemy puppets, they were complete life forms. They had souls, could think and could even learn to create, but they were quite emotional. The most common place for these life forms was the Clockwork Nirvana's mechanical mirror. The red-haired pirate sighed helplessly. She looked a little frustrated. Before she came, she was ready to complete the task given by Soren, but in the end she did not expect that she could not even see him. This was not a small blow to her, and it even made her doubt her own ability. There was also a sense of urgency in her heart. Now she only hoped that the great arcanist would take the time to look at the things she brought. Otherwise she would not know how to explain to Soren. In the past she did not have much contact with high-grade spellcasters. But now, Adele Isabella found that those high-grade spellcasters were really quite difficult to deal with. In the camp. Because 3 people suddenly disappeared last night, the other pirates could not help but have a trace of panic on their faces. Even if Soren ordered to block the news, the pirates still vaguely knew about the shadow plane. For ordinary people, supernatural things were very rare, and the things that crossed the material plane were more of a legend to them. The shadow plane was quite unfamiliar to the pirates. Many of them did not know what the shadow plane was, so many of them felt a little afraid because of the unknown. Knowledge of the plane. This was indeed a very distant thing because many people, except for wizards and other spellcasters, had to wait until they were close to the realm of half-legends before they could expand their vision to the scope of the plane. Soren's knowledge of the plane was not very rich. After all, he had only explored a few planes, but he was still very clear about the shadow plane. This was the core plane that was connected to the material world. Like the spirit world, it directly overlapped with the material world. It was like 2 folded pieces of paper about the same size, but one was at the top and the other was at the bottom. There was a slight difference between the two. The shadow plane belonged to the half-material plane, and there were many half-energy life forms in it, so it was more closely connected to the material plane. The spirit world belonged to the energy plane, and there were almost no flesh and blood life forms in it. Most of them were spiritualized beings, which were completely energy life forms, and were directly connected to the kingdom of death. Wizards had many spells that could let the soul enter the spirit world, or directly spiritualize the body to enter. These spells were a bit like the projection of the astral plane. The material plane, the half-material plane, and the spirit energy plane. These were the core 3 layers of paper. Outside these 3 layers of paper were the other planes of the multiverse, and everything was wrapped in the almost endless sea of the astral plane. Soren knew very little about traveling in the astral plane, but he knew that traveling in the astral plane without the strength of a legend was basically suicide. Most of the time, traveling in the astral plane was done through projection. It was rare for the real person to go there because the astral plane was too dangerous. Soren returned to the hall. The pirate leaders below were all gathered by him, and then they were assigned tasks one by one. Soren's face didn't change at all, as if what happened last night was nothing at all. As the core of the camp, he must be as steady as Mount Tai at all times, so that the people below could work with peace of mind. Time passed quickly. The order in the camp seemed to have been restored. Except for an area where no one else was allowed to approach, everything else was almost the same as before. The slaves were busy working and the pirates were speeding up the construction. Some of the native prisoners captured yesterday had already started working, and there were double the number of guards next to them to watch over them. These people couldn't be raised for nothing. When the drows began to move, soon all the native slaves had to start working. "Brother?" Vivian's petite figure appeared in the hall. She seemed to have just woken up. She raised her little white hand and rubbed the corner of her eyes and wondered, "What happened? Why do you want to surround that area?" Soren looked at the little girl who had just woken up, and a rare smile appeared on his face. He concisely said, "This place is also connected to the shadow plane. 3 people went missing last night. I found a shadow crack there in the early morning, and I saw a complete wizard tower inside. Vivian, are you sure you can enter the wizard tower? The little girl's expression was serious. After a moment of contemplation, she said seriously, Brother, a wizard tower is quite dangerous, especially a complete wizard tower. Even the two of us may not be able to crack its defense program. If it's really a complete wizard tower, I suggest you invite Sister Gloria. I'm afraid only she can crack many of the core keys. Chapter 275. Eastern Sea Route. 3 ocean cargo ships appeared in front of them, and the sailors on the deck could be vaguely seen. But because they were too far away, they were all small black dots. The half-elf first mate took off his delicate monocular with a grin, then made a gesture behind him. Immediately, a fast ship was released. Most pirate ships paid attention to speed, and the hull of the fast ship was relatively narrow. This kind of ship could not carry anything, but it was quite useful for intercepting cargo ships. Get close. The half-elf first mate's expression was a little excited, and he said in a deep voice, Gunners, get ready. Catch up with the fast oars. Others, get ready to board the ship. Since he got the information about Eastern Sea Route, the half-elf first mate had been preparing to rob them. Not to mention the other goods on the ship, the craftsmen from the east were very important. These were all the manpower needed by His Excellency Throat Cutter. The half-elf first mate had been recruiting in Port Tylon, the city of wealth and Shipwreck Bay for a long time, but he still could not find first-class craftsmen. He heard that the woman, Adele Isabella, had gone to complete another task given by His Excellency Throat Cutter. As the half-elf first mate who had always wanted to be Soren's #1 fighter, he naturally hoped that his ability to complete the task could be better than the red-haired female pirate. In order to successfully take down the other party, he mobilized the elites of Port Tylon, Shipwreck Bay, and Snake Island at the same time this time. Soren took away some of the elite pirates, but there were still some left. Want to run? The ocean cargo ship in front obviously noticed that something was wrong, and it seemed to want to go around and escape. The half-elf first mate showed a playful smile and said in a deep voice, Where can you run to on this sea? This south coast is the territory of His Excellency Throat Cutter. It's useless even if you run to the ends of the earth. Men, raise the black flag. Prepare for battle. A black flag was hung up, and the pirates shouted excitedly. The cargo ship in the distance was obviously a little flustered, but they began to arrange calmly. This made the half-elf first mate a little surprised. After all, their numbers were much higher than the other party. But it didn't matter. Recently, Soren's men had greatly expanded, and more pirates wanted to join. There were nearly 1,000 people near Shipwreck Bay. A small number of casualties were within the acceptable range. After all, the world was different, and most pirates were low-level professionals. Otherwise, according to the standards of Soren's previous life, a pirate king like him was equivalent to a pirate's nest owner who ruled over a region, with thousands or even tens of thousands of people under his command. One of the most representative figures was Jing Qinggong of the Ming dynasty. He monopolized a part of the ocean trade routes and used the wealth of ocean trade to support an army. Gloria? Soren could not help but fall into deep thought. As a former legendary rogue, he naturally knew how dangerous a wizard tower was, not to mention that it might be a wizard tower left behind by the Arcane Empire. Judging from the position of the wizard tower, Soren suspected that it was the work of an arcanist who built 2 wizard towers at the same time. One was built in the material plane while the other was built in the shadow plane. These 2 adept towers resonated with each other, and then acted as a passageway to open up the space between the planes, which then opened up a dimensional passageway to develop a dimensional demi-plane. Their final form. It was the legendary floating fortress at the core of the twin towers. The 2 wizard towers would rise at the same time and connect to each other. Soren had explored many ruins, and this kind of twin tower masterpiece was common in the ruins of the Arcane Empire. Because the great arcanists were very afraid of death and were very careful, they were afraid that someone would use the shadow plane as a springboard to find their weakness, so they simply built a wizard tower in the shadow plane. After all, they were quite rich. Soren's judgment was based on evidence. Because the location of the 2 wizard towers was similar, and there was a strange energy field in the material plane, it seemed that after the collapse of the wizard tower on the surface, there was still a part of the ruins underground. This was the sign of preparing to build a floating city. The wizard towers built in the current era would not develop a large underground space. Only the Arcane Empire liked to build a huge underground community under the wizard tower. If it was really a wizard tower from the Arcane Empire, then Soren had to be very careful. There was no other reason. In the era of the Arcane Empire, the standard combat guards of the Sorcerer Tower were not steel golems, but the legendary, magical construct puppet. In fact, Soren preferred to call them Magic Reaver. The technology of golems was passed down all the way from ancient times. This kind of technology had peaks and valleys such as the Nesser era, the Silver Age, the Arcane Empire, and so on. There were also many valleys such as the current golem technology. Soren had fought against some very difficult golems in the underwater ruins, so it could be said that he was quite afraid of this. It was simple to understand. It was like having someone take a sword and dismantle a Gundam. Just thinking about that scene was enough to make one drunk. Gloria? Soren looked at Vivian in front of him and gently nodded. If you can invite her over, it will be a lot easier. I just don't know if she is willing to come to such a remote place. Vivian heard the words and rolled her eyes at Soren. Her voice was a little cheerful. Sister Gloria will definitely be willing to come over. Because my brother is here and I am here too. Besides, if this is really a wizard tower left from the Arcane Empire, there must be a lot of very precious information in it, as well as the spells of the Arcane Empire. Sister Gloria must be very eager to get this knowledge. It would be best if she could come over. The Avatar crisis had begun to ferment, and it would not be long before the Queen of Spiders' plan began to be arranged. She was one of the first gods to come to the material plane, and soon the drows would gradually appear in the eyes of the world. Basically, in Soren's memory, there was no particularly safe place on the continent. The territory of the northern witches was also affected by the chaos, and the demons of the abyss and hell took advantage of it. If Gloria stayed in the north, she might not be as safe as in the outer islands. Soren actually cared about her very much. Maybe he could take this opportunity to invite her over. After all, he couldn't directly say that the world was going to change, that the world was going to collapse, and that the gods were all falling down to fight, causing the mountains and rivers to collapse, the sky to collapse, and the earth to sink. The demon army was killing everywhere, and the devils were sowing discord. In the end, the whole world was almost broken into pieces. If he said that, Gloria would probably think that he was crazy, or that he was so crazy that he couldn't be cured. Soren cared about very few people. Although his bottom line was getting lower and lower, and he was becoming more and more ruthless in his actions, he still hoped to be able to keep the people he cared about by his side so that he could protect them when necessary. Chapter 276. 3,000 miles south of the north. This was a lush high-slope area which used to be a lush forest. However, as the human kingdoms began to develop this area, a large number of trees were cut down, causing quite serious soil erosion. The consequences of this soil erosion directly led to the emergence of a yellow river, but it was not called the Yellow River in this world but the Nile-Dona River. This was the language of the Ascenda, the descendants of humans during the Arcane Empire, who could live to more than 120 years old. This name meant Turbid River. Looking south of the Nile-Dona River, there were scattered villages and towns. These were the gathering places of human beings. Since 300 years ago they had been constantly cutting down trees here. Now, from the Lost Forest to the Dark Forest area, the number of trees had decreased by at least 1/3. These trees were like the Han people in the Central Plains. For various reasons they cut down the forest in the upper reaches of the Yellow River, and then completely led to uncontrollable soil erosion. Regarding this matter, it could be said that the Druid Conclave was quite dissatisfied. There were fierce conflicts between the two sides because of this, but because there was no powerful Druid organization in this area, and there was another very special existence, so in the end the result was still inconclusive. However, after the soil erosion was more obvious, humans began to notice some problems, and a little restrained the cutting and development in the past. There was almost a budding industry here, but in the end, it was suppressed in the beginning by all forces. At this time, near the edge of the Lost Forest, a graceful and vigorous figure was moving forward at high speed. She was wearing an exquisite leather armor with a special emblem on her chest. Even though she was covered in dust, it could not cover up her heroic spirit. This was a knight in silver. She seemed to have been on the road for a long time. When she saw a thick smoke in front of her, she could not help but speed up her pace and rush toward the place where the smoke was coming from. A village appeared in front of them, but it was eerily silent. They couldn't hear the sounds of chickens and dogs barking. There were no signs of human activity. A loud and clear cry of an eagle rang out. Then an eagle flew down from the sky and turned into a middle-aged droll with thick hair for a moment. He glanced at the knight in silver next to him and said in a deep voice, "There is no one else nearby. I don't know why the Droll Council suddenly sent us here to investigate. Is there something more important here?" The knight in silver's expression was serious as she whispered, "Listen. There's no movement at all. There's almost no one alive here." The two of them headed towards the village. The village in front of him was almost destroyed. There were burn marks everywhere and there were many corpses on the ground. The knight in silver leaned over and looked at the corpses. Then, with a solemn expression, she said, "It wasn't done by bandits. None of their belongings were taken. It seems like the cause of their deaths is a little strange. Over there." The middle-aged droll closed his eyes and sensed for a moment. Then he pointed in a direction and rapidly approached. The knight in silver quickly followed. As they passed through the burned ruins of the house, everything in front of them made their faces pale. This was because they saw many corpses. There were men and women, young and old, as well as women and children. There were many traces of burning firewood nearby. In the center there was a corpse that was almost burnt to a crisp. There were many messy footprints on the ground. It seemed that many things had happened before everything happened. Fallen? The middle-aged droll looked around, turned around, looked at the knight in silver and asked, "Or other evil existences?" The knight in silver's expression was serious. She picked up a small piece of dark red skin from the ground and looked at it. Then she said, "It's the devil. Let's go. We must report to the council immediately. A devil has appeared here." Damn it. How did the devil of the purgatory of Bator come out? Eastern Sea Route. The half-elf first mate stuck out his tongue and licked the blood on his arm. He had just been stabbed by a sneak attack, but the injury was not serious. As a pirate he was used to being injured. Next to him his men were bandaging him. Some fierce pirates were kicking the surrendered captives, mainly some crew members who had no fighting power. "How are the casualties?" The half-elf first mate asked his men to tie a knot directly on the bandage. Then he stood up and said, "How many died? How many were injured? Have all the enemies been cleaned up?" A rather shrewd-looking pirate ran over, bowed his head and said, "Your Excellency. 32 died and about 50 or 60 were injured. All the enemies who resisted were killed. There were still people under the cabin who wanted to resist, but they were also killed by us. All the things are sealed under the cabin. We know the rules of His Excellency Throat Cutter. We can guarantee that no one will sneak down." "Okay." The half-elf first mate nodded slightly and said with satisfaction, "Don't touch the things below. When we return to Port Tylon there will be rewards for you." He stood up and walked down the cabin where the slaves were transported. Those things were nothing at all. There were other ways to make money. What he really cared about the most was the slave craftsmen from the east. The task given by His Excellency Soren was still the most important. The half-elf first mate quickly brought his men to the bottom of the cabin. Most of the slaves locked up inside had oriental characteristics. They looked a bit like people from the desert, but their skin was a little yellow. The outline of their faces was not as clear as the people here, and the lines of their faces were softer. "Who are the craftsmen?" The half-elf first mate looked at the 50 or 60 slaves in front of him. The eastern trade route would not transport those cheap goods, so the quality of the slaves in front of him was relatively high. A quick-witted guy quickly came over and answered, "There are more than 30 craftsmen here. There are more than 10 over there. All of them are imported Eastern gladiators. They will be sent to the City of Wealth and then sold to the underground arena on the south coast. These slaves are all very valuable." "Gladiators?" The half-elf first mate showed a look of interest on his face. He walked in front of an Eastern gladiator and looked at the strong man in front of him. The man's muscles were not very strong, not as exaggerated as many of the warriors here, but his muscle lines had a sense of strength and fluidity. It was said that the Eastern gladiators were more agile, and some of them had been trained by Eastern monks. It seemed that the rumors were true. Note: many of the Eastern warriors are level 1 or 2 martial monks. Their training method is similar to that of martial monks. "Take them all back." The half-elf first mate glanced at the shackles on the other party's hands and said, "These people look a little useful. His Excellency Throat Cutter is in need of manpower. Maybe there will be a chance to use them." He glanced at the innermost part of the cabin, then walked over carefully and asked, "What's in the cage over there? Why is there no sound at all? Is it empty?" Someone immediately brought a torch over. As the light shone, the creature in the cage appeared in front of them. Many people couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Then someone suddenly realized something and said, "This is Is this an Eastern werbeast? What appeared in front of them was a little girl. She was a very, very small girl, at most 6 or 7 years old. She was wearing a floral dress and her face was a little messy. However, one could see her big eyes and fair skin. That wasn't the most amazing thing about her. What was even more amazing was her ears. They were furry like a cat's ears, and there was a small cat's tail sticking out of her butt. A werbeast? The half-elf first mate couldn't help but look at her in surprise, then murmured, "It seems to be the legendary Catwoman? I thought this kind of werbeast was extinct. I didn't expect to find one in the East." Whoosh. Facing a group of ferocious-looking pirates, the little girl in front of them seemed a little afraid. However, the courage in her heart made her bare her teeth at them, revealing an obvious pair of small canine teeth as if she was wild and untamed. Werbeasts began to decline significantly after the Arcane Empire and were now very rare. The specific reason for their appearance was unknown. Anyway, legend said that it was related to something taboo. After all, the great arcanists had always wanted to get their hands on the realm of the gods, including the part of creating life. The half-elf first mate looked at her curiously, then ordered, "Don't hurt her. This Catwoman looks quite rare. Bring her back and give her to the young mistress as a gift." The young mistress he mentioned. Of course he was referring to Vivian. But in fact he was mainly referring to Vivian because only she would occasionally order them around. Now, among Soren's core subordinates, who didn't know that Vivian was the apple of Soren's eye? Not to mention Vivian's strength was somewhat unfathomable to them. The half-elf first mate walked out quickly. There were already a few people waiting outside. One of them, a middle-aged man with a pair of single-rimmed glasses, looked a little gentlemanly and didn't look like a pirate. Instead, he looked more like a merchant's shopkeeper. The goods on the 3 ships have been counted. There are a total of 26 boxes of porcelain, 21 boxes of tea bricks, about 12 boxes of other spices, and some rare silk fabrics. The total value is probably more than 50,000 Kindler coins. If we can sell them to the local nobles, the value is estimated to increase by 50%. Hearing these words, the half-elf first mate couldn't help but stare blankly. Then he murmured, "So much. So valuable?" He felt that something was a little wrong. Because the value of the goods on the 3 ships seemed to be quite high. And they were the most expensive and valuable goods on the Eastern Sea route. Chapter 277. In the hall. Soren fell into deep thought. After a while he seemed to have made a decision. He raised his hand and called in a few words, then walked towards the place where the slaves were held. The drow's enslavement skills were quite brilliant. Not only did they use a variety of punishments, but they also used powerful psychological cues. Many ordinary creatures would gradually become more obedient once they accepted the change of their status as slaves. After further training, they would become qualified and docile slaves. The slave's consciousness of resistance was actually not too strong because most creatures had a servile nature. It was better to be alive than dead. The inferior natives that were captured last time were basically working. Their status in the tribe was similar to that of slaves because the basic structure of the native tribe was chiefs, priests, nobles, warriors, inferior people, and slaves. However, these natives would slack off from time to time, and they didn't work that hard. They needed to be whipped by the pirates in charge of supervising them to be obedient. Soren walked around a little, then went to the place where the shadow crack appeared. At this time, he also took out the information prompt that he had read once. "You've entered the shadow plane. You've completed your first official interplanar travel. You've obtained part of the information of interplanar travel. Your dexterity has reached 25 points. You've successfully entered the shadow plane. You've obtained part of the information of the legendary skill, Shadow Realm." This was the information prompt that he got when he entered the shadow plane. Soren was not too unfamiliar with the legendary skill, Shadow Realm. So it was not surprising that he got the information prompt of this legendary skill because this legendary skill was composed of 3 parts. In other words, this information prompt needed to appear a total of 3 times, and it had a very high requirement. After successfully meeting the requirement, Soren could master the legendary skill, Shadow Realm. Back then he had received the first message even earlier than now because someone had opened the shadow portal for him at that time. For now, it would take some time to get the 3rd information prompt. Soren had to at least raise the total profession level of the rogue to above 15 before he could get the 2nd information prompt of Shadow Realm. As for the 3rd information prompt, the requirement was even higher. Soren's life form must have a certain connection with the shadow plane. Any kind of domain ability was quite difficult. Naturally, it was quite difficult to master. There was another notification. That was the first notification that appeared. It was a passive supernatural ability. Stats were one of the most important foundational abilities in a player's body. Normally, once a player reached 20 points, they would enter the realm of transcendence. Among all the stats, Constitution was the easiest to break through. When a player reached 20 points, they would be able to obtain their first passive ability, which was the regeneration effect that Soren had chosen at the beginning. As for the later special abilities, they would need to have at least 25 attribute points. Coincidentally, Soren's dexterity had increased to 25 points after obtaining minor divinity. Thus, he mastered a passive ability. Epic dexterity, gifted ability. Your dexterity has exceeded the limits of mortals. Be it your sense of balance or coordination, they are all at a level that mortals can't reach no matter how hard they try. I'm afraid that only characters from Legends and Legends, as well as the incarnations of gods that descended to the mortal world, would be able to compete with you in terms of agility. From now on, your agility has completely surpassed the realm of mortals. You will gain an epic +1 point in all agility-related tests. At the same time, your basic evasion will be permanently +2. Note, legendary evasion is a prerequisite skill. This was an important passive ability for rogues. Not only because of the epic +1 point, but also because of the permanent +2 evasion bonus. Basically, many powerful legendary abilities in the future required the corresponding epic attribute as a prerequisite. For example, epic constitution was the basic condition for many powerful abilities of warriors. As a qualified legendary profession, at least one attribute must be increased to more than 25 points. Half a day passed quickly. At night, Soren and Vivian both came to the place where the shadow cracks first appeared. Although he intended to invite Gloria over, Soren was still going to go in and check it out first. After all, as long as he didn't get close to the wizard tower, it was relatively easy for him to deal with the creatures in the shadow plane with his current ability. Not to mention that the creatures in the shadow plane were cross-plane enemies. Although it was quite difficult to deal with them, there was an innate reward of about 20% slaughter EXP. But for cross-plane enemies, compared to the monsters in the material plane of the same level, there was basically a 10% to 20% slaughter EXP reward. That was why many people liked to run into the abyss of hell. Time passed little by little. Soren waited until early morning, but he didn't see the shadow cracks appear. At this time, Vivian, who was sitting next to Soren, was a little sleepy, and her little head was leaning on Soren's leg. It seems that it may not appear today. Soren reached out and stroked the little girl's hair and said softly, "Vivian, why don't you go back and rest first and I'll wake you up when it appears." The shadow cracks didn't appear regularly. There were many factors that could affect its appearance and even its location could change. So when it did not appear until now, Soren knew that today might not be the day for it to appear. Anything that could cross planes required a little patience. Back then, in order to wait for the entrance to the underground ruins to appear, he had waited in the desert for an entire month and a half before the dimensional passage to the ancient ruins appeared. The final reward was naturally quite rich. Vivian gently shook her head, and then shrank into Soren's arms. Since she didn't want to go back and rest, Soren couldn't force her to go back. He took off the cloak from his back and covered the little girl's body, and then silently watched the shadow in front of him. The night passed just like that. Soren waited until the sun rose, but the shadow cracks still didn't appear. He wasn't too worried about it. During the day he was still busy giving orders to his subordinates to supervise the slaves' work, and the whole camp was built little by little. Then when night fell, he went to the location where the shadow cracks appeared, and waited quite quietly for the night. Time passed like that for 2 days. On the third day, when Soren came to keep watch, a crack gradually appeared in front of his eyes, and he could see another gray world through it. Chapter 278. It appeared. Soren waited for 3 whole days and finally the shadow fisher appeared. He turned around and glanced at Vivian behind him. Today she was wearing a black princess dress with a beautiful bow on her head. After noticing Soren's gaze, the little girl smiled sweetly and said, "Big brother, I'm so happy to see you. Don't worry. I've read a lot of information about the shadow plane. I'm sure there won't be any danger. Besides, Sister Gloria used to tell me a lot about planes and half-planes. Maybe she knows more than you." The shadow plane. Soren was most familiar with this plane, even more so than the prime material plane. It was a transitional plane connecting the material plane with other planes. Strictly speaking, it was a large semi-material plane, a spatial world between matter and energy. From the shadow plane, one could reach most planes, so there were a lot of unpredictable dangers in this plane. Especially at the edge of the overlapping planes, one could be directly sucked into space turbulence. That was why Soren was very careful every time he entered the shadow plane. There were a lot of dangerous areas and powerful creatures here. The most common one was the shadow dragon. There weren't many types of dragons in the shadow plane, but the shadow dragon was the most numerous. Strictly speaking though, Soren did remember where the nests of many shadow dragons were, but he couldn't beat them at all. Even if he had Vivian with him, it would still be a little difficult because he remembered that the shadow dragons were all mature and above. The world began to turn gray. As Soren's figure passed through the shadow fissure, his whole body was dyed with a gray hue. The shadow plane didn't reject other colors, but any color here would have a gray shadow. This change came from the structure of the plane. No one could resist it unless they used a spell. It was one of the rules of the plane. For example, the sky and sun of the shadow plane. Sometimes it would rain, snow, and hail, but the color would always be gray. No matter how bright the sun was, it could only ever be a bright gray color. That was why it looked like dusk. This was the paradise of shadow creatures. Be careful. Soren turned around and looked at Vivian, who was looking around. The little girl seemed to be very interested in this plane that was completely different from her original world. She even curiously reached out to pull out the weeds on the ground. The color of the plants was grayish-green, and there was no difference between them and the material plane. There were many unknown secrets about the existence and characteristics of the shadow plane, and some were even unknown to the gods. Therefore, there were still many inexplicable things about this place. For example, the buildings here might be extremely similar to those in the material plane. And it might not necessarily be the current material plane. It was possible that the shadow plane retained the buildings of the material plane thousands of years ago. Projection. The incomprehensible projection interfered with matter and was then replicated in the shadow plane. This kind of projection could not be understood with common sense, and not everything could be projected. So far, no one had been able to figure out this secret. Most of the things that could be projected into the shadow plane seemed to be random, but there was an energy limit to this projection. For example, a castle from hundreds of years ago in a material plane could be projected into the shadow plane, but a wizard tower built in a material plane could not be projected into the shadow plane. This was because most of the castles were ordinary buildings, but wizard towers were covered with a considerable amount of energy. Soren had traveled back and forth in the shadow plane so many times, and the only thing he knew was that most of the buildings projected from the shadow plane were things that had existed in the material plane for a long time. If it was just a house built this year, it was basically impossible to project into the shadow plane. However, if the house had existed in the world for hundreds of years, it could be projected into the shadow plane. Therefore, there were many cities and towns in the shadow plane. The places where these projections appeared could be quite ancient, and there were some shadow creatures living there. The projected buildings were not much different from those in the material plane. They would gradually disappear with time, so there were very few things that had existed in the shadow plane for a long time. A wizard tower appeared in front of him. Looking at it from afar, he could feel the majesty of it. It was different from the current wizard towers. During the Arcane Empire, wizard towers pursued height. The great arcanists often liked to build wizard towers to overlook the earth. The overall structure of a wizard tower was a bit like a lightning rod. Today's wizard towers were generally relatively short, and they rarely exceeded 300 meters in height. Therefore, it was easier to identify wizard towers from any period. Be careful. Soren raised his hand to stop Vivian, who wanted to go over and take a look. He whispered, "There are distorted shadows nearby." Distorted shadows. Semi-energy life forms, due to certain reasons, may have the characteristics of a soul. To put it simply, many of them were transformed from souls. Distorted shadows, shadow life, gregarious species, grade 3. Challenge rating 12, personal level 14, has spell-like abilities. Highest and lowest attributes 20, lowest attributes 10, total attribute points 90 to 95. Special abilities, shadow characteristics, semi-energy body, soul molding. Difficulty, B+. Soren was quite familiar with the ability of the distorted shadows, but he still found it difficult to deal with them because these creatures were not vulnerable to physical attacks. Semi-energy life forms were born with more than 20% concealment ability. If they were half-energy life forms, they could also reduce physical damage by 50%. It was very troublesome to deal with them with ordinary weapons. Although Soren had the legendary curved sword Icing Death, he basically did not have the ability to kill a distorted shadow in one hit. Moreover, these shadow creatures liked to live in groups. Therefore, their difficulty was B+, and they were a very difficult enemy to deal with. Sizzle. There was a faint sound coming from somewhere. Soren quickly took a step forward and protected Vivian's small body behind him. At the same time, he carefully looked around. There were not many life forms in the shadow plane. Strictly speaking, there were not many living creatures with flesh and blood. Therefore, the animals living here were quite rare. Sometimes, it was so barren that even the shadow dragons had to go to the material plane to eat a big meal. The life forms here were full of destructive and aggressive. They were a combination of chaos, hatred, and bloodlust. In essence, they were not much better than the bottomless abyss. Distorted souls could be reborn in the shadow plane. This was the origin of many half-energy life forms. There were also a lot of undead here. Creak. The sound became louder and Soren also heard the source. It came from under the soil in front of him. Under the soil? Soren's rich experience in the past made him ready to fight in an instant. At the same time, he said to Vivian beside him, "Be careful. There are undead ahead. They smell the living on us." Undead. Supernatural monsters. There was only one kind of undead in the shadow plane, and it seemed to be a difficult monster to deal with. Skeleton undead. When Soren saw a monster crawling out of a tomb-like mound in front of him, his face gradually became serious. Because the skeleton undead in front of him was a little different. Its height was more than 2 meters. Although its bones had been twisted and mutated into sharp bone blades, it could still be seen that it was a tall and dangerous creature when it was alive. The next level of this undead was the skeleton demon, a quasi-legendary undead with a challenge rating of 12 and a monster level of 20. There was no priest. There was no way to dispel the undead. Soren glanced at Vivian beside him, nodded gently, and flew away. It seemed that he really needed to find a priest partner in the future. After all, whether it was healing or dispelling the undead, a priest's role was quite important. They were the core members of the Iron Triangle. But the problem was, where could Soren find a priest above grade 3? This kind of priest status was not low. Just look at the pivotal position of the Naga Siren priestess in the coastal area, and you would know how high the status of a high-grade priest was. Dab, dab, dab. Soren's curved sword in his hand made a burst of metallic sound on the body of the skeleton undead. At this level, the undead were not simple skeletons. They were very dangerous supernatural creatures. Ghoul touch. When Soren slashed several times on the body of the skeleton undead, suddenly there was a foul smell around. A dark red glimmer appeared in the eye sockets of the skeleton undead in front of him. This smell made Soren very alert and took a step back, but the undead still touched him slightly. Spell-like attack. It was the innate ability of the high-grade undead. Soren almost had no time to react, and a series of data appeared in front of his eyes, affected by the spell, Ghoul Touch. Mandatory test of exemption triggered. Test of fortitude passed. You are immune to the paralysis effect of this spell. A control-type spell. Soren suddenly broke out in a cold sweat, and then he slashed the enemy's leg bone with his sword. Fortunately, he had high constitution and fortitude, so he was directly immune to this second circle spell. Otherwise, he would have been paralyzed directly, which would be quite dangerous. Fortitude, will, spell, and so on. All kinds of immunity were quite important. Rogues were not as muscular as warriors, so they were at a disadvantage in terms of test of exemption. Be careful. Vivian's reaction was also very fast. When Soren was hit by the skeleton undead, she began to cast spells quickly. However, the little girl's talent was really amazing. While casting spells, she could also pay attention to the surrounding environment. When she saw distorted shadows around her, she immediately shouted, "Brother, be careful. There are a lot of distorted shadows around you." Chapter 279. Twisted Shadows. These half-energy shadow creatures did not need to eat like other monsters, and they did not have a fixed nest. They did not even leave traces of movement. Therefore, most of the time, there was no way to determine their location at all. Only when these monsters emerged could one know which shadow they were hiding in. Fortunately, these monsters basically had no intelligence. They acted purely on instinct and were full of destructive desire and aggression. Otherwise, they would be quite difficult to deal with. Clusters of shadows emerged. These twisted shadows had a characteristic, that was, in the strange twisted bodies, there was a vague and hazy human figure hidden in the shadows. It was said that this was their soul. Twisted shadows were said to be the souls of many creatures that died in the shadow plane. These shadow-like monsters were everywhere in the shadow plane, especially in the cities of the shadow plane. These shadow-like creatures were often seen. Flame arrow, acid arrow, missile storm. Because Soren was in the range, Vivian did not dare to use a large-scale attack spell. She could only kill the twisted shadows one by one. At the same time, she used acid arrow to aim at the skeletal undead. Acid was very corrosive to bones. Although acid arrow was only a spell below grade 3, it was very lethal to many creatures. Stone skin shield. Haste. Soren did not dare to be careless in this situation. He directly activated the elemental stone, and at the same time activated a piece of equipment that he obtained from the legendary naval battle. It could temporarily activate the haste effect, but it could only be used twice, and the duration was relatively short. High-grade rare items were too rare. There were not many of them on the south coast. The best equipment Soren had was the 2 items given to him by Princess Royal of Arendelle. It seemed that after dealing with the outer islands, he would have to take time to go to the desert area. Soren remembered that there were 3 legendary items there, as well as the Cloak of Anti-Detection, which was very important to rogues. Dow. His curved sword turned into a ray of light and slashed at the skeletal undead. Soren jumped more than 10 meters and slashed at the twisted shadow at the same time. The blade seemed to have cut into tough rubber. Soren furrowed his brows as he slashed at the shadow. At the same time he retreated. However, the shadow had already pounced on him. Even though the shadow's arm only brushed past Soren's shoulder, he couldn't help but tremble. A row of data popped up. You've been attacked by distorted shadows. Distorted shadows has dealt 1 bruise to you. You've been affected by shadow erosion. Received an additional 14 damage from shadow corrosion. Shadow strike. Soren countered the attack with a backhand slash. Twisted Shadow's corrosive attack was similar to Shadow Strike. Both attacks used shadow energy to corrode the opponent. The distorted shadows didn't have high HP. After being hit by Soren a few times, one of them finally died. Soren received a total of 3,250 slaughter EXP. Shadow-type monsters gave 20% slaughter EXP. Hailstorm. As soon as Soren put some distance between them, Vivian took the opportunity to cast a spell. The little girl quickly chanted the spell, and then a whistling wind and sharp hail appeared within a 40-foot radius. This was a level 4 spell. It wasn't a very common spell, but it was perfect for the current situation. It just so happened that Soren was out of the spell's range. Compared to the explosive impact of Fireball, Hailstorm was able to slightly affect the enemy's movement while killing them. Sword form, spinning strike. Sword form, beheading. Soren took the opportunity to kill 2 distorted shadows around him. After enduring the shadow energy's corrosive attack, he finally got rid of the trouble around him. The next part of the battle became a lot easier. Vivian's hailstorm caused a lot of cold damage. Soren turned around and began to harvest the distorted shadows' heads. He received nearly 20,000 slaughter EXP in one breath. However, the skeletal undead died in the hands of Vivian in the end. Its cervical vertebra was directly melted by the acid arrow. Otherwise, it would have given about 5,000 slaughter EXP. He simply cleaned up the battlefield. The skeletal undead didn't give anything. Instead, the distorted shadows dropped 3 gray crystal fragments. These were materials for alchemy. A kind of crystal that contained soul energy and elemental energy. Only a few special creatures would appear. This crystal could be directly used to exchange equipment in the hands of high-grade wizards. Soren carefully put it away. He had been too busy recently to learn alchemy. Vivian focused on learning spells and basically didn't dabble in alchemy. The brother and sister probably had less than 50 alchemy points combined. The 2 rested for a while and then moved forward again. However, this time they had to be more careful. Vivian didn't dare to run around because it was obviously more dangerous than the material plane. There were almost no monsters after that. Soren led Vivian forward for about 300 meters. A broken building appeared in front of them. They were already close to the periphery of the wizard tower. There were many broken buildings nearby. It seemed that there used to be a group of people living around the wizard tower. Be careful. Soren turned around and looked at the little girl. He then said, "Let's see what's here. It seems that no one has been here for a long time. Don't get close to the wizard tower so that you don't trigger its defense mechanism." Vivian nodded gently and then said with a serious expression on her little face, "Big brother, There seems to be a legendary defense lock in front of us. This might be the wizard tower of an arcanist. It was gray in front of them. The space under the wizard tower seemed to be a little distorted, and it didn't look real. Maze lock was a technology from the Arcane Empire, and it could be understood as a very powerful array. Those who could set up a maze lock were basically arcanists. During the period of the Arcane Empire, not all wizards were arcanists. This was an advanced profession that required a lot of talent. It could be understood that only legendary wizards could advance into the Great Wizard. The two were advanced professions with a certain origin. Soren nodded slightly and then pushed open a door on the left. It was full of dust. There didn't seem to be any monsters, but there didn't seem to be anything either. When Soren was about to leave, he suddenly seemed to have found something. He immediately squatted down and knocked on the wall with his hand. Then he pulled out his curved sword and stabbed it in, directly digging a hole in the wall. It was empty. There was a delicate box in the hole about 30 centimeters wide. Fortunately, my searching ability is not bad. Soren reached out and knocked on the box. He then signaled Vivian to step back. He took out a lock-picking tool from his multi-dimensional bag and was about to open the box. Chapter 280. There would be many secret compartments in the ruins. This was related to the habits of the people in the current world. Whether it was nobles or wizards, many liked to set up some secret compartments in their homes to store things. This habit was similar to the ancient landlords in the Central Plains who liked to dig cellars to store gold and silver. Some even put the cellars in places that others could not imagine. Therefore, in the adventure of the underground ruins, it was necessary to have a teammate with good search skills and intuition about the location of the treasure. This kind of person was usually a rogue. A teammate with the intuition of a treasure-hunting mouse was also very popular in the adventure of the wilderness ruins. Soren's intuition was not very strong. Strictly speaking, he basically did not have the talent of intuition. It was entirely based on careful observation and rich experience in the past that he found that there was something wrong with the wall just now. There were different traces in the seam and the color was slightly lighter. Then he reached out and knocked on the wall. The hollow wall could be felt with a knock. Then he directly used his curved sword to cut the wall open. For this kind of ancient ruins, it was not realistic to find the location of the opening mechanism because it might have been completely damaged. When Soren had just started his career, he was blocked by a stone statue for a long time. He could not find a way to open it. In the end, the barbarian among his companions came with an axe. They found that the mechanism of the hidden compartment had been damaged. If they did not open it by force, they would not be able to find the mechanism outside for a lifetime. Then Soren began to study the aesthetics of violence. He mastered the violent demolition technique in the exploration of the underground ruins. The key to this demolition technique was to destroy the mechanism without damaging the things inside. It was also a very useful skill, and it had a significant effect on many underground ruins. Dang dang dang. Soren touched the box and knocked it a little. After making sure that it was not a trap device, he began to prepare to pick the lock. However, he had just inserted the lockpick tool into it and then he pulled it out. He picked up the handle of the legendary curved sword, Icing Death, and smashed it directly at the position where the box was locked. After 3 consecutive bangs, the lock of the box was finally broken. Soren turned around and glanced at Vivian. The little girl's mouth was slightly agape. She had seen her brother pick locks with exquisite skills, but she had never seen him smash them open so violently. After all, Soren used to be a skilled thief and he wasn't as strong as he was now. Soren turned around and glanced at Vivian. Slowly he said, "The lock inside is already rusted. There's no way to open it. Be careful, step back." "I wonder if there are any traps inside." Vivian nodded and took a small step back. There was a saying in adventure, break locks, break doors, break boxes and guarantee that you won't die. Soren put the box on the ground and opened it carefully. There was no sound of a mechanism being activated, nor was there any magic being triggered. It looked just like an ordinary box. This kind of trap was impossible to guard against. He was used to being careful. After all, there were many rogues who failed miserably. There weren't many things in the box. Soren saw 2 gems, one was a diamond, the other was a carnelian, and then there was a magic scroll and an empty crystal bottle. Soren threw the diamond and carnelian to Vivian behind him. The little girl reached out and caught them. Her beautiful big eyes narrowed into a crescent moon. She wiped the dust on the gems with her sleeve and put them away. Vivian liked gems. Whether it was diamonds, emeralds, or carnelian, she liked these things very much. The little girl had now filled a small box. Part of it was given to her by Soren, and the other part was from her robbery of the pirate leader below. But it was mainly because Lillian would do it. In this regard, Lillian refuted, "I'm the Witch of Fear. If I don't have a lot of gems, won't I lose face? So what's yours is mine, and what's mine is still mine." Yes, that's it. The bottle was empty. It might have been filled with some kind of potion in the past, but this kind of crystal bottle used oak stoppers. The potion inside might have evaporated long ago. Even if the potion inside was still there, Soren didn't dare to taste it. This potion was at least 100 years old. Back then, there were people who died in a daze. They dared to taste the potion that sank in the ruins 1,000 years ago. As a result, they died instantly from the poison. One of Soren's rules was to not eat anything in the underground ruins, including water. The spell scroll was still intact, which surprised Soren a little. This was because the material of the spell scroll must be very good to be able to be preserved for such a long time. He carefully opened the spell scroll, afraid that it would be damaged by too much force. But it seemed that Soren worried too much. This scroll was made of an unknown leather and it felt quite tough to the touch. This might be a high-level spell scroll. Thinking of this, Soren's face couldn't help but reveal a trace of surprise and expectation. The value of a high-level spell scroll was quite astonishing. If he could get his hands on one, then this trip would be worth it. However, when he saw the mark engraved on the spell scroll, Soren couldn't help but reveal a trace of disappointment. There were engravings on the spell scroll, which represented the circle of the spell recorded. This was a third circle spell scroll. Because there were 3 intersecting engravings on the top corner, no one would deliberately make a mistake. So this spell scroll should only be a third circle spell. A third circle spell. It didn't seem to have much value. Soren had already bought a batch of spell scrolls from the City of Wealth. Among them, the proportion of third circle spells was not small. Maybe the scroll in front of him was one of the scrolls that he bought. But when Soren looked at the spell scroll in front of him, he suddenly felt a little confused because he couldn't understand the symbols on it. This seemed to be a spell scroll from the time of the Arcane Empire, and it used some kind of spell code that was more difficult to understand. This kind of scroll was like an anti-theft code. You could activate it to use it, but it was very difficult to copy it. It didn't seem simple. This was the first thought that came to Soren's mind. Because there was no need to use a spell code for a third circle spell, unless it was a very special and powerful spell, or someone's unique spell. Spells were not static. Many times there were innovations and changes, but most of the spells that were passed down were the same. Unique spells were rarely passed down and some of them were even lost. For example, the spell Mordenkainen's Sword, that was very commonly used by wizards. This 7-circle spell was originally a unique spell, and later it gradually spread to the hands of other wizards. Couldn't understand it? No problem. Soren could take it back and study it slowly. Besides, Vivian was right beside him. Just because he couldn't understand it didn't mean that Vivian couldn't understand it. Soren carefully picked up the spell scroll, then handed it to the little girl next to him and said in a deep voice, "Vivian, see if you can understand the symbols on it. This seems to be a special spell scroll." The little girl heard him and took it. Then she frowned and looked at it. Then she whispered, "Brother, it's full of spell code. I can't understand a lot of it, but I know the name of this spell. Melf's Minute Meteor. This seems to be a third circle spell. It actually uses meteor as its name. It seems to be very powerful." Melf's Minute Meteor? When Soren heard the name of this spell, his whole body couldn't help but tremble. Then there was a hint of surprise on his face and he murmured, No wonder. It's actually this spell. No wonder it needs to be recorded in secret. Third circle god-slaying spell. The legendary Melf's Minute Meteor. The reason why Soren was so impressed by this third circle spell was very simple. It was because someone used it to successfully slay a god. He killed the first demigod lich that appeared during the Avatar Crisis. He was also the first demigod lich to be killed in a cross-level challenge at that time. Melf's Minute Meteor became famous because of this. It almost became the #1 cross-level challenge spell among the low-level spells. It was also the only low-level spell that could break the force field of the divine law. Melf's Minute Meteor, Evocation, Alteration. The caster creates miniature meteors in his hand. This energy creation is regarded as a +5 rare weapon. It can cause 3+ spell power explosive damage to the target, as well as an additional 3 points of fire damage. The number of miniature meteors created is equal to casting level +1. Before all the miniature meteors are consumed, no other weapons can be used to fight. A spell that didn't look very impressive. In terms of damage, it was not comparable to the fireball spell at all. This was because the fireball spell of a high-grade caster could reach nearly 100 points of spell damage. But there was a very special thing about Melf's Minute Meteor, it was a magic creation and was regarded as a +5 rare weapon. Even the demigod Lich was not immune to the explosive damage caused by it. In terms of damage penetration, even the icing death in Soren's hand was not as good as Melf's Minute Meteor, so it was also called Dragon-Slaying Meteor. Because it could break the dragon's dragon scale protection, the effect was similar to a grenade explosion. Wherever it hit the dragon, there would be a small dent there. Finally, another reason why it was sought after by countless people at that time was that it was really cool when it was cast. The caster's hands would be wrapped in flames, and then 2 small meteors would be formed in the palm of the caster's hand. When attacking, the caster would throw the meteors. The meteors that were shot out would roar out and explode violently after they touched the target. At the same time, the caster's hands would automatically generate new meteors until the number of meteors that could be created by the spell reached the limit. One could imagine the scene of the adepts hurling meteors down from above. It was really cool. Unfortunately, this spell was not so easy to learn. It had always been a rare spell. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.